In February of 1993, a truly shocking and disturbing crime gripped the UK and sent shockwaves across the world. The details of this case are harrowing, and the events that unfolded on that day in Merseyside are almost too heartbreaking to comprehend. In this video, we will explore the tragic and deeply unsettling case of James Bulger, the 2-year-old boy whose abduction and murder would become one of the most infamous and haunting crimes in the whole of British history. Not only will we discuss the case extensively, but we will also examine the far-reaching consequences the case had on the British nation that can still be felt to this very day. This is the story of James Bulger, a name that should never be forgotten. On the 12th of February 1993, two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, skipped school, a routine that they had unfortunately fallen into. The two boys had histories of behavioural problems, and it was clear to anyone that they were not your typical 10-year-old kids. The day started off innocuously enough, shoplifting sweets, batteries, and a can of blue modelling paint. However, their true intentions that day were far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. At approximately 3:40 PM, Denise Bulger, a mother from Kirkby, Merseyside, momentarily lost sight of her 2-year-old son James whilst paying for some groceries at the A.R. Tim's butcher shop inside the New Strand shopping centre. This fleeting moment would become a nightmare for James, Denise, and their entire family. Within seconds, Thompson and Venables, who had been hanging around at the shopping centre, spotted James and saw a twisted opportunity. They led the innocent toddler by the hand, away from the crowded centre and onto the young boy's final journey, one that would end in unimaginable and truly sickening tragedy. Thompson and Venables took James Bulger on a harrowing walk covering 2.5 miles, a journey that lasted several hours and was punctuated by numerous assaults, as well as opportunities for intervention from the public that were never attempted. The boys led James to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, where they began to exhibit a shocking level of cruelty. They lifted James up by his feet, only to drop him on his head. This caused injuries that left the toddler bleeding and sent him into a distressed panic. Eyewitnesses who saw the trio during their journey reported that James appeared upset, crying for his mother, but no one intervened effectively. Out of the recorded 38 witnesses who saw the boys, only 2 individuals actually approached Thompson and Venables. Sadly, they were rather easily tricked. They told the first witness that James was their younger brother, and then they told the second that they had found a lost child and were taking him to the police station. As the journey progressed, Thompson and Venables' behaviour grew increasingly violent. They took James into a pet shop, but the store owner quickly kicked them out when it became clear that they had no intention of buying anything. The boys then led James up a slope to a secluded location of a railway line in Walton, far away from any members of the public. This is when the true horror really began. Once Thompson and Venables knew that they were far out of sight, they threw the blue paint that they had shoplifted earlier into Bulger's left eye. Then, they began to punch and kick him. When he fell down, they stomped on him. And once they tired of that, they threw stones and bricks at the helpless 2-year-old child. Next, they forced him to bite down on live batteries. It is rumoured and widely believed to be true that they sexually assaulted him as well, by forcing more batteries up the young boy's... I'm not even going to say that. The horrific torture culminated when the boys dropped a 10-kilogram railway fish plate, a piece of metal used to join railway tracks together, onto his head, causing James to suffer a further 10 skull fractures. Pathologist Alan Williams stated that the poor little James had suffered over 42 fatal injuries, so many that he could not determine which one ultimately ended the young boy's life. In a final act of desecration, Thompson and Venables placed James's lifeless body on the railway tracks and weighed it down with rubble. They were hoping that a train would hit him and obscure the true nature of his death. Tragically, their plan partially succeeded and his body was severed by a passing train. Fortunately, forensic evidence proved that he had died before the train struck him, meaning that their sickening cover-up was not successful. Little James's mutilated body was discovered 2 days later by a group of 4 schoolboys who happened to be in the area, marking the grim end of a nationwide search and the beginning of a painful period of mourning for the family, community, and nation as a whole.
Pinned to a telegraph pole in Liverpool tonight, a personal message from James Bulger's cousins, a rose in his memory and a plea to his murderers: please give yourself up. Dozens of bunches of flowers have been laid in response to a crime whose shadow is hanging heavily over the city, the appalling murder of a defenceless toddler. The discovery of his remains has led to a massive public response. Detectives are tonight studying the evidence so far accumulated.
Contained in the massive information which has come in during the course of the day, as my staff are now sifting through it, I only hope that contained in there somewhere is that vital piece of information which we're looking for.
The discovery of James Bulger's body sent shockwaves throughout the UK. The sheer brutality of the crime, coupled with the victim's young age, ignited a media frenzy and widespread public outrage. The police were under immense pressure to find the perpetrators. Early on, they released the CCTV footage from the New Strand shopping centre, showing 2 boys leading James away. Initially, it was assumed that the suspects were older teenagers, given the severity of the crime, but as the investigation progressed, the shocking truth began to emerge. A breakthrough in the investigation came when a woman recognised John Venables from the CCTV footage and recalled seeing him in town with Robert Thompson on the day of the abduction. Her tip led the police to the boys, who were subsequently arrested and brought in for questioning. The fact that the suspects were only 10 years old not only stunned the police, but also the entire nation. It was almost impossible to fathom that children would commit such an atrocity. The trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables was one of the most widely reported in British history. The fact that the defendants were children, facing charges of such heinous crime, made it impossible for anyone to ignore. The media coverage was relentless, with newspapers and television channels vying for every detail of the case, often sensationalizing the events to gain more viewers. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly hostile towards the boys, and the entire country viewed them as embodiments of pure evil rather than human beings. Rightfully so. The trial began on the 1st of November in 1993 in Preston in Lancashire. It was conducted as an adult trial, a decision that would later be heavily criticised. The courtroom setting was meant to intimidate the 2 killers, who were seated in raised chairs so they could see over the dock, surrounded by guards and social workers. Although their parents were present in the courtroom, they were separated from the children. The defense argued that the boys were too young to fully comprehend the consequences of their actions and should not be held to the same standards as adult offenders. They invoked the principle of doli incapax, which presumes that children under the age of 14 cannot be held legally responsible for their actions unless it is proven that they knew what they were doing was seriously wrong. However, the prosecution, led by Richard Henriquez, successfully rebutted this principle, arguing that Thompson and Venables tried to cover up their crimes, which demonstrated a level of cunning and malice that indicated that they knew exactly what they were doing. On the 24th of November 1993, after a 3-week-long trial, the jury found both boys guilty of the abduction and murder of James Bulger. They were the youngest individuals in modern British history to be convicted of murder. Mr. Justice Morland, who had presided over the trial, described their crime as an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. He sentenced them to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, with a recommendation that they serve a minimum of 8 years before being considered for release. This would mean that the boys would be released when they reached the ages of 18. The James Bulger case gripped the UK in a way very few cases have before or since. The murder of a toddler by 2 other children was almost too shocking to comprehend, and the public reaction was intense and often vitriolic. There were calls for harsher punishments, and even the reinstatement of the death penalty for such crimes. The media played a significant role in shaping public opinion, often blurring the lines between news reporting and sensationalism. The case also prompted a significant political response. Michael Howard, the Home Secretary at the time, announced a review of the sentencing for juvenile offenders and later increased Thompson and Venables' minimum sentences to 10 years. This decision was met with both approval and criticism, as it raised questions about the balance between justice and the potential for rehabilitation. The case sparked widespread debate on the age of criminal responsibility in the UK, which remains at 10 years old, one of the lowest in the whole of Europe. A vocal minority argued that Thompson and Venables should not have been tried as adults, while most others believed the severity of the crime warranted adult-level consequences. This debate continues to this day, with the Bulger case frequently cited as a key reference point. In June 2001, after serving only 8 years, Robert Thompson and John Venables were released from the secure children's homes. Their release was accompanied by new identities, lifelong anonymity, and strict supervision as part of their parole conditions. The decision to release them was very controversial, with many feeling that justice had not been fully served, whilst a few others argued that they had paid their debt to society and deserved a chance at rehabilitation. Personally, that argument makes no sense to me. If they deserve a chance at rehabilitation, that means they have not yet been rehabilitated and thus should not have been released in the first place. The case took yet another disgusting turn when John Venables was arrested again in 2010 for possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but was released again under strict conditions. In 2017, Venables was once again arrested and convicted for similar offences, leading to further imprisonment. His repeated reoffending has ignited many debates about whether he was truly rehabilitated and whether the decision to release him in 2001 was premature. My opinion, along with that of James's family, is that neither killer should ever have been released. The James Bulger case left an indelible mark on British society, influencing everything from criminal justice policies to media ethics, and the way people parent their children. The decision to grant lifelong anonymity to Thompson and Venables upon their release set a legal precedent, with similar measures being considered in other cases involving juvenile offenders. The age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales, still set at 10, continues to be a contentious issue, with ongoing debates about whether it should be raised. The case remains a powerful reminder of the complexities of justice, the capacity of evil, even in the youngest individuals, and the profound impact such events can have on a society's collective conscience. As we reflect on the tragedy of James Bulger, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the importance of justice, compassion, and understanding in the face of unimaginable horror. The tragic story of James Bulger is not just about a crime, but also about society, humanity, and the never-ending quest to protect our most vulnerable members. Thank you for watching. I won't bother asking if you enjoyed this video, but if you learned anything, then please throw the channel a like and subscription. What are your opinions on the sentencing of the two killers? I think a 10-year-old knows the difference between right and wrong. I certainly did, and so did these two, given the fact that they tried to hide their crimes. Let me know what you think in the comment sections below. Comments are one of the best ways to help this channel grow. Rest in peace, James Bulger. May you never be forgotten.
Armed with a hammer and a screwdriver for protection, a terrified couple hurry to a public telephone. The time, 6 o'clock in the morning. The date, October the 7th, 1965. The place, a Manchester Overspill council estate.
Which service do you require?
Police! There's been a murder.
Between 1963 and 1968, the north of England was plagued by a crime spree so despicable it almost defies belief. In today's documentary, I will take you through the twisted story of the Moors murders, exploring the minds of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, their horrendous acts, and the impact their heinous crimes had on the wider community. Before we begin, I want to warn you that this video contains some graphic content, such as descriptions of child killings. Do not continue watching if you are easily offended. Ian Brady was born under the name Ian Stewart on the 2nd of January 1938 in Glasgow, Scotland. His mother, Margaret Stewart, was a single waitress. He had never met his father, but recalled Margaret telling him that he was a reporter who worked for a Glasgow newspaper but had sadly died 3 months before she gave birth. His mother was very poor, and when she was unable to continue funding her and her son's life, she put him into care. Ian moved in with Mary and John Sloan, a couple who Margaret knew for a while. They took good care of the young boy, and his mother regularly visited him so that he never had to feel abandoned. When he was 9 years old, the family moved into a new council house in Pollock. There are many claims that around this time the young boy started to torture and kill animals. However, Brady himself always denied this. Brady was enrolled at Shawlands Academy, a school intended for students with above average abilities. However, this was also when his behaviour took a dramatic turn for the worse. During his teenage years, Brady found himself being summoned to court on 2 separate occasions for housebreaking. He had a girlfriend, but after he discovered that she had attended a dance with another boy, he threatened to kill her with a knife. The relationship then suddenly ended, and Ian continued his life of crime. His criminal activity intensified from there, culminating in a 3rd court appearance, this time facing 9 charges. Although the specifics of these charges remain unclear, they painted a clear picture of a young man spiraling out of control. As his 17th birthday approached, Brady narrowly avoided prison, being placed on probation instead. One of the conditions of this probation required him to live with his mother, who had moved to Manchester by this time, offering him a fresh start in a new city. In Manchester, Margaret had remarried, taking on the name Brady after her new husband, Patrick. Ian adopted his stepfather's surname, symbolising the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Patrick Brady helped the young Ian secure a job at the local market, and for a brief time, it seemed as though Ian was on the path to stability. However, this hope was short-lived. Within a year, Ian was caught stealing lead seals from the market and trying to sneak them out. Because he was still under 18, he was sentenced to 2 years in a borstal, a type of young offenders institution from the time of the British Empire. Whilst incarcerated, Brady was caught brewing alcohol, leading to his transfer to a more notorious unit in Hull, where discipline was far stricter. Brady was released in November 1957 and decided he needed to better himself. He went to the local library and rented some books to help him do just that. He astonished his parents when he locked himself in his room for hours at a time to study. By January 1959, Brady's efforts finally bore fruit when he secured a clerical position at Millward Merchandising, a chemical distribution company located in Gorton, a tough, working-class area of Manchester. Myra Hindley was born on the 23rd of July 1942 in the same rough Manchester neighbourhood of Gorton. Her father, an aggressive alcoholic, terrorised her household, often unleashing his frustrations on both his wife and children. The family lived in crushing poverty, barely able to scrape together enough to survive. When Myra's younger sister Maureen was born in 1946, the family's finances became even more strained. Unable to care for both girls, Myra's parents sent her to live with her grandmother. Myra's father, an army veteran who had fought in World War II, demanded toughness from his children. He believed in the values of self-reliance and physical strength, which he imposed on Myra at a young age. Determined to mold her into someone who could defend herself, he taught her how to fight. One day, when Myra was around 8 years old, a neighborhood boy scratched her, causing her to run home in tears. When she told her father about the incident, he responded not with comfort, but with a harsh ultimatum. If she did not retaliate, he would beat her himself. Motivated by fear and the desire for her father's approval, Myra found the boy and beat him unconscious. This violent response earned her praise from her father, further cementing the twisted lesson that violence was an acceptable and even commendable means of solving problems. Experts later suggested that Myra's early experiences with her father's brutality deeply shaped her personality. They argued that her unusual relationship with her father brutalized her, and that she was rewarded for violence. This foundation would later play a significant role in the horrific crimes that she would commit. Myra found her first job as a junior clerk for a local engineering firm. She was well liked there, and her colleagues had nothing but positive things to say about her. When she was 17, she briefly became engaged, but called off the wedding when she realized that the unknown young man was too immature for her tastes. It would take a few more years before Myra's and Ian's paths would cross. In January 1961, Myra secured a job at Millward's Merchandising, where Ian Brady had been working already for a couple of years. At first, they barely spoke, but Myra quickly became infatuated with her mysterious colleague. Despite their lack of interaction, she began obsessively writing about him in her diary, captivated by his brooding demeanor and apparent intelligence. After nearly a year of working side by side, Brady finally asked Myra on a date in December. They went to the cinema, though there is some debate over which film they saw. While many sources claim it was Judgment at Nuremberg, a dark legal drama about Nazi war crimes, Myra later insisted that the film was King of Kings, a biblical epic. Given the couple's shared fascination with Nazi ideology, Judgment at Nuremberg sounds like the more likely choice, and maybe it is, though personally I believe Myra that they saw the King of Kings. It just seems way too weird to me that someone would take a girl on a first date to watch a movie about Nazis. It definitely does fit in with their future activities though. Their relationship quickly intensified. The pair often went to the cinema together, returning afterward to Myra's house, where they drank wine and discussed their shared interests. Brady eventually introduced Myra to his disturbing collection of Nazi literature and memoirs, which she eagerly devoured. Soon, the couple began reading these books to each other during their breaks at work, immersing themselves in a dark, twisted worldview. It was around this time that Myra began bleaching her hair blonde in an attempt to look more like the perfect Aryan. The couple also began to rent vans, which they would sit inside of and plan bank robberies, which they were probably inspired to do by the infamous American criminal couple Bonnie and Clyde. Driven by their fantasies, Myra joined a rifle club, where she was taught about firearms and how to shoot them. She eventually acquired a Webley 45 and a Smith & Wesson 38, weapons that the couple planned to use during the robberies. However, despite all of their plotting, the plans to rob banks never materialized. In the June of 1963, Brady moved in with Myra at her grandmother's house, and by July, the couple had begun to discuss how to commit the perfect murder. Brady seemed to have become infatuated with a book called Compulsion, by Maya Levine. The story is about two young men who attempt to commit the perfect murder of a 12-year-old boy, but are caught. They ended up escaping the death penalty because of their age. This seemed to inspire the pair to commit their first murder, and on the 12th, they set out to do just that. Brady wanted to kill a child, but Myra dissuaded him, convincing him that a teenager would be a better target. She said that there would be less attention to the disappearance of a teenager versus a child. The following part of this script is based off of Myra's statements, which differ slightly from Brady's. I will point out the differences to you. Brady told Myra to borrow a van and drive around the local area. He would follow close behind on his motorbike until they found the perfect victim. When he spotted someone, he would flash the headlights of his bike as a signal for Myra to stop. Eventually, they came across a young girl, and Brady gave the signal. 16-year-old Pauline Reed was walking alone on her way to a dance class when Myra pulled up alongside her. The pair were acquaintances, since Pauline went to school with Myra's younger sister, Maureen. Myra offered the young girl a lift to her class, and Pauline got inside of the van. When she was inside, Myra asked her to help search the nearby Saddleworth Moor for an expensive glove that she had lost, and Pauline agreed. The pair drove to the moor, and Brady followed behind. Myra told Pauline that Brady would also be helping with the search. As they arrived, Pauline exited the van and Myra stayed behind. Brady then led the 16-year-old out into the moor before viciously attacking her. After about 30 minutes, Brady returned to Myra and then led her to where Pauline lay dying. She had 2 vicious cuts across her throat and a 4-inch deep incision in her voice box. Myra then asked Brady if he essayed Pauline, to which he replied, "Of course I did." This sadly happened to almost all of the couple's victims, both girls and boys, so for monetization's sake, I will no longer mention it. Please just assume that it happened. Brady then returned to the van to retrieve a shovel that he had stashed nearby, leaving Myra alone with the dying girl. When he came back, Myra returned to the van, leaving Brady to bury the girl alone. Brady's account was almost the same as this, however, it differed when he stated that Myra was not only present for the murder, but that she also participated in every part of it. A few months would pass, and on November 23rd, 1963, the couple visited a busy local market. Amongst the stalls and crowds, they happened to come across 12-year-old John Kilbride. His innocent appearance and vulnerability caught their attention, and they saw their next victim. Approaching the boy, they offered him a bottle of sherry and a ride home. Once inside the car, the couple charmed the boy with small talk before suggesting that he may help them search for a lost glove on the moors, the same deception that they had used on their first victim. The trio drove to Saddleworth Moor, the same desolate, windswept location where Pauline Reed had met her grim ending just a few months earlier. Brady led John away from the car, telling the boy that he would show him the search area. Myra supposedly waited behind, knowing full well what was about to unfold. As they ventured deeper into the empty moorland, Brady suddenly attacked the unsuspecting boy, attempting to slit his throat with a 6-inch serrated blade, a weapon that he had likely chosen to maximize suffering. However, When the blade proved unsuitable for the horrific task, Brady resorted to a different method. Grabbing a shoelace, he strangled the young John, taking pleasure in watching the life fade from the bleeding child's eyes. His life was snuffed out in an instant of unimaginable terror. After the act, Brady buried John's small, lifeless body in a shallow grave. Once he was done, he called Myra over, and in an act of sickening pride, Myra posed for a photo on the burial site with her pet dog. I cannot find many details regarding the next victim, but I will do my best to be thorough. On the evening of the 16th of June 1964, Myra came across a 12-year-old boy named Keith Bennett as he was walking to his grandmother's house. She asked him for help loading some boxes into her van and then offered him a lift home in exchange. The boy obliged. Once inside the van, Keith looked back and saw Brady, who didn't say a word. Myra used the same old story, mentioning the lost glove as an excuse to lure him out onto the moor. When they arrived, Myra pulled over in a secluded lay-by, far from any prying eyes. Brady then exited the van, beckoning for Keith to follow, before walking off into the distance and vanishing from Myra's sight. After about 30 minutes, Brady returned alone, his face expressionless. Myra asked him what he had done, and he told her that he had strangled the 12-year-old with a piece of string, an act that was quickly becoming his MO. Keith's body would never be found. On the 24th of December 1964, Christmas Eve, the killer couple would claim another young life. That evening, the streets of Manchester were full of families hurrying around, preparing for the next day. Myra and Brady visited a local fun fair in search of their next victim. It didn't take long before they spotted little Leslie, who seemed to be alone. They immediately devised a plan, deliberately dropping some shopping bags in front of her, and then asked the 10-year-old for her help to pick them up and carry them to the car. Leslie, unaware of the danger, kindly agreed to provide them with her assistance. Once they had lured her back to their car, they forced her inside before quickly driving back to their new home. By this time, the couple had moved out of Myra's grandmother's home and now had their own place. What happened next was by far the worst murder of all. Inside the privacy of their home, the couple began tormenting the young girl in a truly sadistic manner. Forced to undress, the terrified child was then gagged and made to pose for a series of disturbing photographs, the couple taking pleasure in documenting her fear and humiliation. Brady and Hindley, devoid of any empathy, then ended her life by strangling her with a piece of string, the same one that had claimed the lives of other victims before her. To make matters worse, this appalling crime was recorded on an audio tape, with Leslie's agonizing screams and desperate pleas for her life echoing as a haunting reminder of her suffering. Both Brady and Myra's voices can be heard on the tape, their cold, remorseless commands drowning out little Leslie's cries for mercy. In later statements, Myra tried to distance herself from the murder, claiming that she had gone to run a bath and returned only to find the child already dead. Brady, however, shifted the blame back onto her, stating that it was actually Myra who had delivered the final blow. I personally believe Brady here, since he admitted to ending all of the other victims' lives. I don't see why he would blame Myra for only one of the killings, but none of the others. Regardless of who physically ended Leslie's life, both were equally complicit in her torture and murder. The following morning, they drove up to the moor once again and buried her small body in a shallow grave, adding another innocent child to their growing graveyard. Almost a full year would pass before they would strike again. On the cold and dark evening of October 6th, 1965, Myra drove Brady to the busy Manchester Central Railway station. The train station, filled with large crowds of travellers, provided the perfect hunting ground. Brady scoured the faces of the crowd, looking for someone that he believed he could easily manipulate. After just a few minutes, he returned to the car with 17-year-old Edward Evans, an apprentice engineer. Poor Evans had no idea that he had just put his life into the hands of a monster. The three of them then drove back to Myra and Brady's home to share a bottle of wine. This was by far the pair's oldest victim, and I assume that they offered him a drink because they were worried that he might be able to put up a fight. They laughed and joked with Evans, which is actually extremely sinister if you really think about it. Imagine sitting with someone, cracking jokes, asking them about themselves, learning all about them, the whole time having every intention of ending this person's life. It's seriously twisted stuff. At this point, Myra's younger sister, Maureen, had married a young man named David Smith, a figure who would soon become integral to the unravelling of their child-killing spree. Over the previous few months, Brady and Smith had formed a friendship, and Smith looked up to Brady as a kind of role model. Myra supposedly disapproved of this friendship because she was worried that Brady might try to kill Smith. I'm not sure if she was worried because she cared for Smith or if it was something more selfish. It's very possible that she only cared since Smith was too close to home and they were likely to be investigated should something happen to him. Whether these were Myra's true feelings or just another lie, when Brady ordered her to fetch her brother-in-law, she followed that order without question. It seems the killer couple had actually planned for something like this. When Myra invited Smith over, she told him that he first had to wait outside for a signal before he was allowed to enter the building. This signal would be a flashing light. I assume that this must have confused him. Maybe he was even expecting some kind of pleasant surprise when he entered. There's no way that David could have predicted what he was about to witness. Eventually the signal came and David knocked. Brady invited him inside and then left him in the kitchen, telling him that he was going to collect the wine. Suddenly, David heard a blood-curdling scream, something like a horror movie, only much worse. And then, the screams didn't stop. They came again and again, each one more frantic than the last. Then, in a moment that would haunt him forever, Smith heard Myra's voice over the top of Evan's cries. "Dave, help him." David, who by now was almost paralyzed with fear, suddenly snapped out of it and rushed into the living room. What he saw there was nothing short of a nightmare brought to life. Brady was in the midst of a savage attack, wielding an axe with brutal force as he struck Edward Evans repeatedly. Blood spattered the walls as Brady continued his violent assault, eventually switching to a different method and strangling Evans with an electrical cord. The act was beyond cold-blooded. It was a display of true evil. Brady had sprained his ankle during the frenzied attack, and with the lifeless body of Evans proving too difficult for him to handle alone, he forced David to assist. Together, they wrapped the young man's body in plastic sheeting. They then stored the body in the spare room, intending to dispose of it the next day on the same desolate moorland that had already become a graveyard for their victims. Smith, now an unwilling accomplice, agreed to return the following morning with a pram to help transport the body to the car and ultimately to its final resting place on the moor. Shaken to his core, David finally left the killer couple's residence and returned to his own home at around 3 a.m.
By implicating him in the murder, Brady's intention was to gain control over Smith.
Brady and Hindley tried to coerce David Smith into being involved in the murder of Edward Evans, and they misjudged the whole scenario. They really thought they were going to get a hold on Smith, and it didn't happen.
His body and mind was overwhelmed with shock, and he vomited into the kitchen sink, struggling to comprehend the monstrous act that he had just witnessed. Trembling, he confided in his wife, Maureen, telling her what had just transpired at her sister's home that night. For hours, they just sat together, right up until the first light of dawn broke through the window. At 6:10 a.m, as the sun finally began to rise, Smith, who was terrified that Brady might be watching him, armed himself with a knife and a screwdriver. He took these weapons for protection, knowing the danger he faced if Brady suspected him of betrayal. With his heart pounding in his chest, he made his way to a phone box on the estate. There, he called the police, recounting the horrific events of the previous night. A police car came and picked David up and took him to the police station. Officers wasted no time. Brady was swiftly arrested, but in a surprising move, Myra was not immediately taken into custody. At first, the authorities believed that she may have been an innocent bystander. However, as they delved deeper into the case, the officers quickly grew suspicious of her also. The evidence began to point not only to her involvement in the murder of Edward Evans, but also to the possibility that she had played a key role in other killings too. On October the 11th, after further investigation, Myra was also arrested and taken into custody. What followed was a painstaking year-long investigation during which the police meticulously gathered evidence. They knew that the public outrage over the case was immense, and they would need an airtight case to bring the pair to justice. In fact, the outrage was so immense that the dock inside the courtroom was fitted with bulletproof glass, a measure to protect Myra and Brady from those who might seek their own brand of vigilante justice. The trial was infamous before it even began. Every hotel room in Manchester was booked, with journalists flooding to the city to cover the case. The press and the public alike were hungry for every detail, eager to see the monsters behind the crimes held accountable. Each day, massive crowds gathered outside the courthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Inside the courtroom, tensions were high as both Brady and Hindley entered their pleas of not guilty. Their emotionless faces only served to fuel the public's already overflowing hatred. Their pleas meant nothing, however, because evidence against them was irrefutable. Among the most damning pieces of evidence were the photographs and audio recordings of little Leslie's final moments. When the tape was played for the court, the entire room was filled with the sound of her desperate cries and pleas for mercy, and an air of utter disbelief filled the room. The voices of both Brady and Hindley could be heard on the tape, making their involvement undeniable. Additionally, David Smith's witness statement painted a vivid picture of the horrifying events that he had also witnessed. After just 2 hours of deliberation, on May the 6th, the jury returned with their verdict. Brady was found guilty of all charges, and Hindley was found guilty of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans. The death sentence had been abolished in Britain only 6 months earlier, so the judge was left with no choice but to sentence the pair to the new highest sentence possible, life imprisonment. Brady was given 3 life sentences to run concurrently, and Myra was given 2. The pair were sent to separate prisons where, despite their physical separation, they maintained contact through letters for over 6 years. However, in 1971, Hindley decided to break off their relationship and eventually launched an appeal for her release, which was swiftly rejected. She claimed to be a changed woman, hoping to convince the world that she had been rehabilitated. Myra remained incarcerated for the rest of her life. Brady, on the other hand, openly stated that he had no desire to be released and showed no remorse for his heinous crimes. Myra Hindley eventually died behind bars in the year 2002, succumbing to respiratory failure. Brady outlived her by 15 years and eventually passed away in the year 2017.
In 1977. The millions of people who used Britain's M1 motorway shivered with fear as they reached its most northerly point, the city of Leeds. They all knew that terror was stalking its streets. 4 women had been murdered in the city by a maniac with a grudge against women. 2 others had been slaughtered in nearby towns, and at least 4 more had been badly injured in his insane attacks with a hammer.
On the cold afternoon of Sunday the 4th of January, 1981, a nationwide manhunt for a notorious and sadistic serial killer finally concluded. After years of relentless searching with little success, the police finally had their man in custody. This individual had claimed the lives of over 13 women and girls in a brutal reign of terror that spanned almost a decade, with several more attempted murders. The Yorkshire Ripper, an infamous serial killer active from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, specifically targeted women and teenage girls. While less well known than the infamous Jack the Ripper, whose name he shares, the Yorkshire Ripper's victim count was far higher, with his attacks occurring under eerily similar circumstances. In this documentary, we will explore the heinous acts committed by the Yorkshire Ripper, listen to audio tapes that were sent to the police taunting them for being unable to catch him, and delve into the shocking police missteps that allowed him to continue his horrific rampage against so many innocent women. Peter William Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the picturesque town of Bingley, Yorkshire. He grew up in a poor, dysfunctional family that always found a way to scrape by. His father, John William Sutcliffe, was an abusive Englishman, while his mother, Kathleen Frances Coonan, was a mentally unstable Irish immigrant. It has been widely reported that John would beat both his children and his wife, even during her pregnancy, and it is theorized that this is what led to Peter being born prematurely. In those days, a premature birth carried far more risks than it does today, and as a result, Peter's growth was stunted. As an adult, he remained far shorter and smaller than average. John was a heavy drinker with a violent temper, often taking out his frustrations on his family. On Christmas Day of 1950, when Peter was just 5 years old, he sat at the head of the dinner table, which enraged his father. Seeing this as a sign of total disrespect, John smashed a glass bottle over his son's head, to teach him a lesson. Peter attended St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School, where he was bullied for being quiet and timid. At home, he clung to his mother to avoid his father's violent outbursts. John ridiculed his son, calling him a wimp and a mummy's boy. Given his father's aggression, it was hardly surprising that Peter stayed close to his mother. Kathleen, however, was not without her flaws. She was unfaithful to her husband and did nothing to protect her children from his violent temper. Perhaps she feared John's wrath as much as her children did, though it doesn't excuse her inaction. In my personal opinion, a mother who refuses to protect her children is no mother at all. Leaving school at the age of 15, Peter took on several low-skilled jobs. One particular job stood out in light of his future crimes. During the 1960s, he worked as a gravedigger at Bingley Cemetery. His co-workers found his macabre sense of humour disturbing, even by their standards, and mentioned that he would often make inappropriate jokes in front of grieving families. He also volunteered for overtime so that he could spend more time handling the corpses, preferring the company of the dead over the living. Many speculate that his premature birth, violent upbringing, and desensitization to death from such a young age contributed to the formation of his deeply disturbed mind. These factors likely played a role in the depravity that he exhibited later in life, solidifying his reputation as one of Britain's most twisted killers. In 1967, Sutcliffe met Sonia Sherman, the daughter of Polish and Ukrainian immigrants who had relocated to England from Czechoslovakia. The pair quickly became infatuated with one another and embarked on a long-term relationship. Sonia would be the only significant partner in Sutcliffe's life. By 1969, Sutcliffe committed his first documented assault. Although he had not solicited her services, a prostitute had conned him out of money. Theories suggest the money could have been for rent, drugs, or food, but whatever the reason, she took advantage of his kindness. Enraged, Sutcliffe sought revenge. One night, he and a friend named Trevor Birdsall were cruising Bradford when Sutcliffe suddenly left the van. He returned a while later, breathless, and instructed Trevor to drive off quickly. As they sped away, Sutcliffe admitted to attacking the prostitute, following her into a garage and striking her in the head with a rock that was wrapped inside of a sock. The force of the blow caused the rock to tear through the sock. However, the woman survived and managed to take note of the vehicle's registration number and report it to the police. The next day, both men were questioned, and Sutcliffe partially admitted to the assault, but claimed that he had used his hand and not a rock. The police informed him that he was very lucky because the woman had chose not to press charges. Sutcliffe eventually left his job as a gravedigger and found work at the Baird television factory in 1971, staying there until 1973. He then moved on to Anderton International, a company that supplied industrial springs worldwide. Sutcliffe and Sonia were married in 1974, and Sonia began training to become a teacher. Sadly, she had to abandon her career dreams after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a mental illness characterized by hallucinations and delusions. Over time, her condition worsened. It is said that Sonia's violent outburst towards Sutcliffe, driven by her paranoia, contributed to his already unstable views on women. By 1975, Sutcliffe was made redundant when his company introduced new technology that reduced the need for workers. He received a £400 severance package, which would be around £6,100 today, that he used to train as a heavy goods vehicle driver. Though he quickly found a job as a driver, he was soon dismissed for stealing used tyres, which he attempted to sell secretly for extra money. The tyres were expensive, fetching up to £100 each. Sutcliffe remained unemployed until October 1975, when he secured a job as an HGV driver for T&WH Clark Holdings Limited. It was during this period that he began regularly soliciting prostitutes, though he stopped after one woman and her pimp extorted money from him. This is yet another event that is believed to have fueled his growing hatred towards women, particularly prostitutes. His mind was broken and he had become a truly sadistic man. Late at night, he began cruising the small towns and cities of Yorkshire, searching for lone women that he could take out his aggression and frustrations on. During one of these cruises, on the night of July the 5th, 1976, Sutcliffe was in the small town of Keighley. He encountered Anna Regulski, who was walking alone. Anna was lost in thought, not paying very much attention to her surroundings. Before you judge her for being careless, I want to remind you that this is a small town in a beautiful part of England during the 1970s. The crime rate was extremely low back then, and England was one of the safest countries in the world. This was before the internet, at a time when people were much more trusting of each other, going so far as to leave the front doors of their houses unlocked because they knew it was extremely unlikely that anyone would attempt to harm them. This was especially true in a town like Keighley, and so women felt safe to walk around alone at night, and in 99 out of 100 cases, they usually were. Sutcliffe stealthily approached Anna with a hammer in one hand and a knife in the other. When he got close enough, he brutally struck her in the back of the skull with the hammer, knocking her unconscious and causing her to collapse to the ground. Kneeling over her, he switched the knife from his left hand to his right and gazed at the helpless woman for a moment, relishing in the sight. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he began his torture. He lifted her shirt to her breasts and marveled at the exposed skin before using the knife to inflict a large gash, slicing her from her left ribs across her stomach all the way to her right. Luckily, a neighbour stepped outside during the assault, interrupting Sutcliffe before he could finish the job. He fled, leaving Anna alive but traumatised. She required brain surgery due to her injuries and suffered from extreme depression following the attack. The unprovoked assault left her terrified of leaving her home, afraid she might be randomly attacked again. She later admitted that there were times when she wished that she had died that night. On August the 15th, Sutcliffe was once again prowling Yorkshire, searching for a victim. That night, he encountered 46-year-old Olive Smelt in the small town of Halifax. After a brief conversation about the weather, Sutcliffe suddenly struck Olive in the head and face with a hammer. Once she collapsed, he tore her clothing and slashed her lower back with a knife. As was the case of Anna, Sutcliffe was interrupted and decided to flee before finishing the job. Olive was severely injured but survived the attack. When questioned by police, she mentioned that her attacker had a Yorkshire accent, a detail that Detective Superintendent Dick Holland chose to ignore. Less than 2 weeks later, on the evening of August the 27th, Sutcliffe attacked what would be his youngest victim, 14-year-old Tracy Brown. Tracy was walking alone along a country lane in Silsden, a rural town in the west of Yorkshire. The narrow road had no streetlights and saw little traffic, as is typical of English countryside lanes, which are often only wide enough for one vehicle with occasional widenings to allow cars to pass each other. Sutcliffe approached Tracy and warned her that it wasn't safe to be walking alone so late. He offered to walk her to her destination, and Tracy, being young and impressionable, trusted him. They walked together for about 30 minutes, and at no point did Tracy feel in any danger. But once they were far enough from any help, Sutcliffe took out his hammer and knife and struck the poor girl 5 times over the head. She fell into a pool of blood, but before he could continue, the headlights of a nearby car startled him, and he fled. Though he escaped before mutilating Tracy like his other victims, she still needed brain surgery following the brutal assault. Months passed without another victim, but Sutcliffe's next attack would be his worst by far. On the evening of October 30th, 1975, Sutcliffe was in Leeds, drinking alone in a pub. At the same time, 28-year-old Wilma McCann, a mother of 4 and local prostitute, left her house in the Scott Hall Council Estate, a type of government-subsidised housing in the UK, and headed out for a night of drinking. She was last seen walking down the Scott Hill Avenue past the Prince Philip playing fields towards Chapeltown. Wilma began her night at the White Swan pub, but after it closed at 10:30 PM, she moved on to the room at the top nightclub, where she stayed until about 1 AM. After leaving the club, she began staggering home, pretending to be much drunker than she really was, hoping that someone would offer her a ride, a common tactic among working women in the area to avoid paying for a taxi. A lorry driver did stop and offer her a lift, but she insulted him, causing him to drive off without her. Later, Sutcliffe drove by and offered Wilma a ride, which she accepted. When she got in the car, she asked, "Do you want any business?" Sutcliffe played along, and Wilma directed him back to the Prince Philip playing fields, about 90 meters from her home. He pulled up and attempted to strike up a conversation with her, but Wilma was impatient. She asked him how long he was going to take, and Sutcliffe told her that he needed to be aroused and that he couldn't just have sex at a split second's notice. Wilma got angry and told him that he was fucking useless before hopping out of the car and slamming the door. Suddenly Sutcliffe was overcome with seething rage, and he decided that he was going to hit her to pay her back for screaming in his face. He hopped out of the car behind her and yelled, "Hang on a minute, don't go off like that." Wilma turned around and began to return to him, whilst taunting, "Oh, you can fucking manage it now, can ya?" Sutcliffe asked if they could do it on the grass next to the car, since there wasn't much room in a small vehicle, but she just laughed at him, saying how she wouldn't bloody well do it next to the car, and began to storm off up the hill into the playing fields. At this point, Sutcliffe circled around his car to his trunk, where he had a toolbox. He retrieved a hammer and hid it in his trouser pocket and chased after her. When he found Wilma in the dark field, he removed his jacket and threw it onto the floor. Somehow, Sutcliffe managed to convince the woman to provide him with her services there in the field, I guess because it was so dark that it was extremely unlikely that anybody would witness it. She obliged and laid down on his jacket, unfastened her trousers, pulling them down, and told him that it would cost £5 and to hurry up and get it over with. £5 in 1975 money is equivalent to about £55 today, or about $80. Sutcliffe ominously responded, "Don't worry, I will." Suddenly he pulled out the hammer from his trousers and violently hit her over the head twice. Wilma passed out and started making a deathly gurgling sound, one so horrific that even Sutcliffe himself was deeply disturbed and panicked by it. He began to flee the scene, but when he got back to his car, he realised that he was going to be in very big trouble for this one, since she had spent time in his vehicle and had seen his face. In reality, the woman was very unlikely to recover from these injuries, but Sutcliffe was not acting rationally. Once again, he circled around his car to the trunk, and this time retrieved a 7-inch knife from the toolbox. He sprinted back to where Wilma lay twitching, and decided to stab her rather than slash her like he had done to his previous victims. Sutcliffe began his butchery by stabbing the mother of four one time in the throat. Then, he lifted up her blouse so that he could make sure he accurately stabbed her in lethal body parts. He proceeded to stab her twice below her right breast, 3 times below the left, and then 9 more times in her stomach area. Wilma stopped moving. There was an extensive police investigation into this crime, given the fact that the victim was a mother and had been brutally snuffed out less than 100 meters from her home where her kids were awaiting her return. 150 officers were involved and 11,000 suspects were questioned, but the police failed to find a culprit. His next attack took place on January the 20th, 1976, also in Leeds. Sutcliffe met Emily Monica Jackson, a 42-year-old prostitute, after a night of drinking. Tragically, Emily had turned to prostitution after her husband, struggling with financial difficulties, had convinced her to do so. Although reluctant, Emily had given in. She got into Sutcliffe's car and they drove approximately 1 mile to a piece of derelict land that was out of sight of the main road that they had just exited. According to Sutcliffe's police interviews, Her quote, overpowering cheap perfume caused him to hate her all the more, even though he didn't actually know her. Emily asked if they could drive deeper into the yard, which was when Sutcliffe decided to pretend that his car was having engine problems and that he couldn't get it to restart. She offered to help the murderer by holding her lighter under the hood so that he could see the engine. Sutcliffe accepted her offer, and as she stood there, he took a couple steps backwards before smashing her over the back of the head with one of his hammers. She immediately dropped to the floor unconscious, and Sutcliffe dragged her deeper into the yard. Once he decided that he was safe to continue, he returned to his car and deposited the hammer back into his toolbox. He then withdrew a screwdriver and dashed back to where Emily lay. Ripping her clothes back to expose her skin, he gazed at her body under the moonlight. For some reason, Sutcliffe was even further overcome with rage and went into a killing frenzy. He stabbed her with the screwdriver a total of 52 times in the neck, breasts, lower abdomen and back. But this somehow still wasn't the most sickening part. Sutcliffe then spent approximately 10 minutes searching the abandoned land for some other kind of weapon, until he came across a thin plank of wood, which he snapped in half. He then returned to the corpse and rammed a splintered and sharp end up the poor woman's vagina, before stamping on the dead woman's leg, leaving the impression of a boot print. When the corpse was discovered, the police took note of this boot print, a size 7 men's. This is quite small for a full-grown man, so the only clue that the police had at this point to the appearance of the Yorkshire Ripper was that he had small feet and thus was most likely to be a below-average build. Almost 5 months would pass with no further incidents. Unfortunately, the peace would not last forever, and in May, Sutcliffe decided that the time had come for him to strike again. On Saturday the 8th of May 1977, 20-year-old Marcella Claxton attended a party with friends and got very drunk. She lived in Roundhay Park, an extremely affluent area of Leeds, with many Victorian-era mansions and luxury flats. However, Chapeltown, where the previous victim Wilma McCann resided, was the complete opposite. This was a poor area of the city, and just so happened to be the location where the party was being held. When it got to around 4 AM, Claxton decided that it was time to call it a night, and set off alone on the short walk home. At the same time, Sutcliffe was cruising the area in his Ford Corsair, with sickening thoughts in his mind. His hatred of prostitutes had only grown since he became a murderer, and when he noticed the drunken Claxton stumbling alone, he assumed that she was one herself, which is entirely untrue. Sutcliffe pulled up next to her and offered her a lift back to Roundhay, an offer which she gratefully accepted. The following events are unclear, since Claxton's reports in the years since the attack have often contradicted Sutcliffe's statements and her own. This is the most likely series of events that I have been able to ascertain through my own research, though please be aware that Claxton's inconsistencies over the years, as well as Sutcliffe's own inconsistencies with her original story, make it difficult to find the truth of the situation. According to Claxton, Peter asked if she was doing business, to which she responded that she wasn't, but asked him for a lift anyway, since he had already stopped his car. Sutcliffe accepted and drove the young woman back to Roundhay Park and to a place known as Soldiers Field. When he stopped the car, Sutcliffe offered Claxton £5 to remove her clothes and have sex on the grass. She said that she did not want to, and then went behind some trees to urinate. In Sutcliffe's account, he said that Claxton went behind some trees to urinate, and she suggested that we get the ball rolling on the grass. Regardless of which version is true, the confirmed fact is that Claxton first exited the vehicle and went to urinate behind some trees. Sutcliffe then got out of the car shortly after she did. When he got out of the car, he dropped a hammer on the ground, and Claxton stated that she hoped it wasn't a knife. Sutcliffe told her that it was his wallet, before walking up to the 20-year-old and viciously attacking her with the hammer. He struck her 8 or 9 times in the head. According to Claxton, he then stood over her as she lay on the floor, masturbated, and then pushed a £5 note into her hand and asked her not to contact the police. This is extremely unlikely to be true, given that he never did this to any of his other victims. However, this is what information that Claxton gave to the police at the time of the original investigation. When Sutcliffe was questioned about this, he became extremely angry and said, "I didn't want sex with any of them, and certainly not that one." Even the police said that she was like a gorilla. That last remark was in reference to an allegedly racist claim that one of the police had made regarding Claxton. On one hand, Claxton was a black woman of African descent, so the claim could have been made in reference to her appearance. The police themselves said that it was not a racist claim, however, and pointed out that Claxton had an IQ of only 50, stating that it was in fact a reference to her below average intelligence. I will leave it up to you to decide what you think about this. Claxton survived the assault and managed to stagger to a phone box whilst bleeding heavily from her head and called for help. She claims that after she had dialed 999, the British Emergency Services number, she saw his car return and drive back and forth multiple times. She thought that he seemed to be looking for her, staring at the location where the attempted murder took place. Claxton believes, as do I, that Sutcliffe had returned to finish her off. The most tragic part of this assault was that even though Claxton herself survived the incident, Sutcliffe still managed to successfully take a life that night. Unbeknownst to her, Claxton had actually been 4 months pregnant at the time, and as a result of the sickening assault, she miscarried the baby. Claxton also required multiple, extensive brain surgeries as a result of her savage injuries. Almost a full year passed before Sutcliffe would strike again, but when he did decide to kill once more, he chose the exact same location as his previous failed murder attempt, Roundhay Park in Leeds. Irene Richardson was a 28-year-old homeless woman, and on the 5th of February 1977, she had managed to scrape together enough money to pay for a room at a boarding house. She told the other residents that she was going to go out for the night to a local disco, and at around 11:15 PM, she left to make her way there. Sutcliffe had been patrolling the area searching for a new victim. Eventually, Sutcliffe spotted Richardson and pulled his car up to the curb a few meters in front of her. Irene hopped into the car without saying a word, which surprised him. He told her that he might not want her, but she told him that she would show him a good time. If only Irene had realised the situation that she had just gotten herself into. Sutcliffe drove to Roundhay Park and then to Soldiers Field, to the exact same spot where he had attacked Claxton 9 months earlier. Irene said that she needed to pee and went to go use the public toilets. Whilst this was happening, Sutcliffe withdrew a hammer and a Stanley knife that he had had in his car and hid them in his pocket. When Irene made it to the toilets, she noticed that they were locked. She hadn't noticed, however, that Sutcliffe had stealthily followed her there. Irene decided just to go on the grass instead and squatted down with her back turned to her killer. As she was squatted down, Sutcliffe struck her 3 times in the back of the head using the hammer. One of these strikes was so powerful that it drove her skull 3/4 of an inch into her brain. This wound was absolutely fatal, though she didn't die instantly. As she lay twitching on the ground, he tore open her jacket and began to slash and stab viciously at the body using the Stanley knife. Before long, he heard voices close by and noticed a car driving away from a block of flats, so he decided to leave. But before he left, he covered her legs with her jacket. Tyre tracks left at the scene resulted in a very long list of possible suspect vehicles, since the tyres were very common at the time. Two more months would pass before the heartless killer decided to strike again. Patricia Tina Atkinson was a 32-year-old prostitute who lived alone in a small flat in the city of Bradford, West Yorkshire. On the night of April the 23rd, She was out drinking at a pub called the Perseverance, which she then left and headed to another pub called the Carlisle. The Carlisle was only a short distance from her home, and she was a regular there. After spending an hour or so drinking, the manager decided that she had had enough and refused to serve her anymore. Sometime between 10:15 and 10:30 p.m, Tina announced that she was leaving, before staggering to the exit. She was spotted and described as obviously drunk by some other prostitutes at around 11 p.m. Sometime soon after this, Sutcliffe was driving slowly around the area looking for a new victim. Eventually he came across Tina as she was banging on the roof of a parked car, clearly arguing with a potential customer who seemed to be trying to haggle with her. Sutcliffe pulled up just behind the parked car, and Tina immediately walked towards him and entered Sutcliffe's vehicle without saying a word. Sutcliffe drove a few dozen meters down the road when Tina blurted out that she had a flat nearby and that they could do it there. Sutcliffe turned the car around and drove the short distance to Oak Lane, where Tina's residence was located. Once Sutcliffe pulled up down the street from the flat, Tina hopped out and began quickly walking to her place, motioning for Sutcliffe to follow. Sutcliffe hopped out of his car as well, and when Tina's back was turned, he reached under the seat and grabbed a claw hammer, which he proceeded to hide in his jacket before quickly following her back to the flat. Once inside, Tina went straight to the bedroom. Sutcliffe hung his jacket up near the front door and retrieved the hammer. Whilst Tina was looking away, he bashed her in the back of the head 3 or 4 times. As she fell, she landed on her bed and bounced off of it, landing on the floor. There was an extremely large amount of blood, which leads me to believe that he had actually used the claw side of the hammer rather than the blunt one. Once Tina was incapacitated on the floor, Sutcliffe hit her one more time. He then scooped her up under the arms and placed her back on the bed. At this point, Sutcliffe ripped her trousers down and shirt up, and then absolutely began to use the claw side as well as the blunt one. He alternated between striking with each side, using the claw to gouge large chunks of the poor woman's flesh away. He further mutilated Tina using a knife, stabbing her 6 times in the stomach region and also attempting to stab her a number of times in the back. He also sliced the left side of her body multiple times. Before he left, he wrapped her up in some bed sheets. Somehow, Tina was still alive at this point, though it was obvious that she wouldn't make it through the night. As Sutcliffe was leaving, she was still making deathly gurgling sounds. At 6:30 p.m. the next evening, a close friend of Tina's named Robert Henderson stopped by her flat to say hello. He knocked a couple of times but received no answer. Before he gave up, he tried the door handle and the door came open. As he stepped inside, he noticed a pool of blood on the floor. Rushing into Tina's bedroom, he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Whilst Tina was wrapped up in the bedsheet, her arm and face were exposed. From the amount of blood all over the bed and how pale Tina was, it was obvious to him that she was indeed dead. Henderson sprinted out of the flat, screaming for the caretaker, hysterically shouting that there had been a murder. When the police arrived to investigate, they noticed a bloody boot print in the hall leading toward the front door. Upon writing down that it was a size 7 men's boot, the officers realised that the Yorkshire Ripper had expanded his hunting grounds to Bradford. He had also committed his first and last murder inside of the victim's residence. Jane Macdonald was a 16-year-old girl who worked as a shopkeeper's assistant and had recently finished school. On Saturday the 25th of June 1977, she had gone to meet some friends at the Leeds city centre at a German-style beer keller called Hofbrauhaus. Whilst at this beer keller, she met a young 18-year-old lad called Mark Jones, and the pair were instantly smitten with one another. They danced for a couple of hours, having the time of their lives, until around 10:30 p.m, when they decided to leave. Walking through the high street, Jane suggested that the pair go look for a fish and chips place so that they could grab something to eat. It took them a while to find the place, and by the time the young couple had eaten, Jane had missed the last bus home. Mark told her not to worry, because his sister owned a car and surely wouldn't mind giving the girl a lift. They sat on a bench together talking until about midnight, when they decided it was time to head back to Mark's place. When they arrived, it became obvious that Mark's sister was not home, since her car was not in the driveway and her bedroom light was off. Instead of heading inside, the pair walked past the house and continued up Beckett Road towards Chapeltown and where Jane's residence was located. Eventually the pair came to a field and they lay down together, looking up at the sky and watching the stars. Jane couldn't believe how much she liked this Mark lad, who she had only met a couple hours earlier. It truly seemed like love at first sight. They remained in the field for another hour and a half or so, before continuing their journey towards Jane's home. Once they had reached Chapeltown, Mark walked Jane to the hospital, only a few minutes away from her house. They said their extended goodbyes and made plans to see each other again sometime soon during the week. Jane intended to call a taxi from the kiosk at the corner of Hare Hills Road, just a few meters away from the hospital where she left Mark's company. When she arrived, she spent a few minutes waiting, but received no response from the kiosk and decided to keep walking alone. She headed through the streets that she knew like the back of her hand, eventually walking past Grandway's supermarket where she worked. She continued onto Chapeltown Road in the direction of Reginald Street and to her home at 77 Scott Hall Avenue, just 6 doors away from the home of Wilma McCann, Sutcliffe's first victim. Sutcliffe had spent the Saturday night drinking with some of his neighbours, and at around 1:45 AM, he dropped them off near their homes. However, he never went home himself. Instead, he turned the car around and drove towards his hunting ground. At around 2 AM, he came across Jane, walking alone. He was certain that she was a prostitute because she was walking through a red light area at night, and because he had supposedly observed her stop and talk to a group of girls on a corner. He followed her on foot for a while, a hammer hidden up his sleeve. Poor young Jane never turned around as he got closer and closer, and about 25 meters into Reginald Street, Sutcliffe caved her skull in from behind. After she fell down, he dragged her face down into a dark corner of a children's play area, her shoes making a horrible scraping sound against the floor as he did so. He smashed her face with the hammer, and then pulled her clothes up and stabbed her 20 times in the chest and back, finishing the child off. The next morning, at around 9:45 AM, 2 very young children discovered the corpse. There was a broken glass bottle still embedded in her chest. When he was watching the news the next morning, Sutcliffe realised his mistake. He only wanted to kill prostitutes, and upon hearing that he had killed an innocent child, he felt terrible regret. He walked into his bathroom and gazed into the mirror, screaming at his reflection. It finally dawned on him what a monster that he had become. Jane's father would never recover from the heartbreak of losing his beautiful 16-year-old girl, and would die just 2 years later. Sutcliffe's supposed grief at what he had done to Jane would not be long lasting, however. About 2 weeks later, on the 10th of July, the Yorkshire Ripper would strike again.
Pick myself up, grabbing hold of grass to try and get up, and I kept falling, and I wondered what was wrong with me. And I kept falling back, and as I was trying to pull myself up, I fell again. And then I was screaming, and I heard this dog barking, and I heard someone say, "Oh, you're all right." And that's all I remember that night. When he get hit over head, at back of head, You can't remember things.
Maureen Long was a 42-year-old woman from Leeds who had travelled to Bradford for a night of drinks. She was spotted out drinking at various establishments by multiple witnesses, and at one of the pubs she visited, she ran into her estranged husband and made arrangements to sleep at his place for the night. After this, she left the pub and continued into a couple different establishments. Eventually, she went to a place called Tiffany's, where she was spotted dancing with many different men. Multiple people stated that she seemed very drunk and that she continued to drink right up until the moment she left, at 2 a.m. Sutcliffe was also out for a night of drinks with the same two neighbours whom he had been drinking with on the night of young Jane's murder. Just like before, once the men were done drinking, he dropped them off near their homes and then turned the car around and drove off alone in the opposite direction. He spotted Maureen as she exited Tiffany's and asked her if she had far to travel. She responded by asking him if he was offering her a lift. Sutcliffe said that he was, and she hopped into the passenger side of his car. She explained that she was living on the opposite side of town in a rundown area called Rendell Street, between the railway yards, and that she was living with an ex-boxer that she didn't much like. Upon their arrival at Rendell Street, Maureen told Sutcliffe not to pull up right outside of the house. Sutcliffe obliged, and instead pulled the car up a short distance down the road. Maureen asked him if he fancied her, and the Yorkshire Ripper smirked, replying that he did. She then said that if nobody was home, he could come inside. With that, she hopped out of the car and went into the building alone, but it seemed that someone was home, so she quickly returned to Sutcliffe and told him that she knew of a place nearby where they could go and directed him to Bowling Back Lane. When the pair made it to Maureen's spot, she squatted down to urinate. As she did this, Sutcliffe did what he had already done to so many women before her and smashed her skull with a hammer. Once she had slumped over onto the ground, he dragged her deeper into the derelict yard and ripped her dress down to her waist. He began to stab, slice, and slash the still breathing woman. A light came on a caravan nearby, but Sutcliffe took no notice of it, choosing to continue the brutal assault instead. Eventually, a night watchman who was patrolling the premises alongside the waste ground was alerted by his dog, an Alsatian, who had begun to bark erratically. He noticed Sutcliffe's car and took a note of the make and model, however somehow he got it wrong. He thought that it was a Ford Cortina Mark II, however it was actually a Ford Corsair. The time is 3:27 a.m. The dog barking caused Sutcliffe to flee, and the next morning, at about 8:30 a.m, two women were alerted by muffled cries coming from the abandoned grounds. They believed the cries to be that of a small baby, so they headed in to investigate. Inside, they found a terrible sight. Maureen had her pants and tights pulled down to her ankles, and the back of her head was badly wounded from the single hammer strike dealt by Sutcliffe. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest, stomach, and back, and had been sliced deeply from her breast to her womb. It was truly a miracle that she was alive. After Maureen had been transported to the hospital, the police searched the crime scene and discovered a bloody palm print on a broken piece of ceramic. They believed that this belonged to the Yorkshire Ripper and took it as evidence back to the station. Sutcliffe soon discovered that Maureen had survived the attack, leaving him not only shocked but terrified. He was certain that she was dead when he left the scene of the crime. Sutcliffe panicked, thinking that Maureen would be able to identify him. A few days later, sadly, he was relieved to discover that Maureen was suffering from amnesia. She was only able to give an inaccurate description of her attacker, and I believe that she was confusing one of the other men who she had danced with that night for Sutcliffe, who did not match her description at all. He was still worried, however, when he found out that the night watchman had written down a description of his car, which was handed in to the police. Sutcliffe sold his car to one of the friends who he was out drinking with. but the car soon broke down, so he had to reluctantly take it back and refund the man, buying a new replacement vehicle soon after and scrapping the old one. During 1977, Sutcliffe's wife, Sonia, managed to restart and complete her training course, gaining employment as a teacher. In September, the couple used the wealth gained as a result of Sonia's new employment to buy a house at 6 Garden Lane in Heaton, part of Bradford, where they moved to on the 26th. This is where the Yorkshire Ripper lived until the time when he was finally captured and charged with the horrific murders. On the 1st of October, Sutcliffe travelled to Manchester, a large city in the northwest of England, to search for more prey. It seems he was still worried about potentially being caught for the last attempted murder, so he travelled to a city which he hadn't got on the hunt yet. As he was cruising Moss Side, the red light district, at about 9 PM, Sutcliffe came across several prostitutes on a street corner. He picked one that he thought was rather attractive and asked her if she was doing business. She told him that she was, and that she would meet him down the road in a bit. The woman was actually about to go with a different man, but instead chose to go with Sutcliffe. In later police interviews, Sutcliffe described this as the biggest mistake of her life. When this prostitute got into the car, she informed the murderer that her name was Jean, before directing Sutcliffe to an old allotment, which had been abandoned and left to overgrow. It was a favourite location not only for prostitutes, but also for regular couples to have sex if they were unable to do so in their own homes for whatever reason. It was surrounded by high bushes on every side, so nobody on the outside could see what was going on the inside. Jean got out of the car and led the way. He followed her from behind, and when they had walked deep enough into the allotment, once more, the Yorkshire Ripper smashed a woman over the head with a hammer. She started moaning loudly on the ground, and Sutcliffe proceeded to strike her 10 more times in the head and face. As he did this, he noticed that they were not actually alone. A pair of headlights came on deeper in the allotment, and he realised that the car was about to drive past him and his victim. Thinking quickly, he dragged Jean in some nearby bushes and quickly made his way back to his car. As he crouched behind it, another vehicle immediately drove into the lot and pulled up into the same spot that the first was parked in. Sutcliffe was spooked by this and quickly scrambled into his car, driving home as fast as he could. During the journey home, he realised that he had left a key piece of evidence at the scene of the crime. He remembered not to leave the murder weapon, however in his rush to leave, he had forgotten the £5 note. Recently, a new design for a £5 note was put into circulation in the UK, and because it was such a new note, it was still somewhat uncommon. Sutcliffe knew that the note could be traced back to him, and the thought of that ate away at him. He felt a sickening anxiety, but decided against going back. The risk of being spotted was too high. When Monday came around, Sutcliffe checked the newspapers, expecting to see a headline about the Ripper striking in Manchester for the first time. He was somewhat relieved, but also confused, when no headline mentioning the crime was published. Day after day passed, and still nothing had been mentioned. Eventually he came to the conclusion that he had hidden the body too well, and it must not have been discovered yet. On Sunday the 9th of October, Sutcliffe was holding a housewarming party. He decided that this would be the perfect time for him to head back to the scene of the crime. At around midnight, when the party had come to an end, Sutcliffe offered to drive his parents back to their home. After he dropped them off, he drove straight back to Manchester. The trip wouldn't take as long as it usually would, since it was a Sunday evening and there would be very little traffic. He made it there just after 45 minutes, and within another 15 minutes, he was back to the allotment. He immediately got to work, searching for the dead woman's handbag, knowing that the £5 note was likely still inside of it. It took him a while, but some time passed and he located the corpse. Just as he had suspected, it was hidden too well to be discovered. He checked the area immediately surrounding the corpse, and even rolled Jean over to check underneath her. He still couldn't find it and decided to expand his search area. After checking a larger area of the allotment and still not finding the handbag, Sutcliffe was overcome with rage. He pulled Jean's decomposing corpse from where it was hidden in the bushes and started rapidly tearing her clothes away. He checked each item of clothing that he removed for the note, all the way down to her boots, still not finding a thing. When he realised that the note was most likely gone, Sutcliffe went into a frenzy and began to mutilate the corpse with a knife. He slashed and stabbed extremely violently, cutting large chunks of rotten flesh away. When he slashed her stomach, there was an explosion of gas, and the stench caused him to puke all over the crime scene. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, DNA testing had not yet been discovered, so the vomit at the scene could not be considered evidence. Because he was so certain that this crime would lead to his arrest, the Yorkshire Ripper decided that all he could do was mutilate the corpse in a way that wasn't associated with any of the previous Ripper slayings. This is when he tried to use the knife to sever the head, but realised that the knife was too blunt for the task. Sutcliffe began searching the allotment for something else that he could use, before coming across a rusty old hacksaw. Unfortunately for him, the hacksaw couldn't get the job done either. Still furious, Sutcliffe kicked the body a few times and cut the throat again. By this point, he had been at the scene of the crime for about 15 minutes, and somewhat rational thoughts began to take hold once more. He realised that he was pushing his luck by staying there any longer and walked back to his car, beginning the journey home. The next morning, at about 10:30 AM, the body was discovered by two passers-by. At first, they thought somebody had dug up a body from a recent burial in a nearby graveyard and then violated the corpse. However, it became obvious that this was not the case when they discovered Jean's clothes nearby. To a trained eye, it was obvious that many of the injuries were caused post-mortem, and that the woman had actually died from a number of head injuries inflicted by a hammer. The injuries to her head were so severe that her skull had been flattened, leaving her completely unrecognisable. When he returned to the scene, Sutcliffe had stabbed and cut the body 18 times in her breasts, torso, and around her privates. 5 days after the discovery of Jean's body, on the 15th of October, her handbag was finally located, with the £5 note still inside. A further 2 weeks after the note was discovered, Sutcliffe was brought in for questioning by the police. The police officers accepted his alibi of being at the housewarming party and decided not to question him any further. 2 months would pass before the Yorkshire Ripper would go out on another hunt. By the 14th of December, Sutcliffe had lost control of his urge to kill once again, and set out cruising his original hunting grounds in Leeds. Marilyn Moore was a 25-year-old prostitute, and on the night of the 14th, she was doing business in Leupold Street in Chapeltown. As she walked down the street in the darkness, a car slowly drove past her. She crossed the street in anticipation of the car turning around and coming back, her assumption proving correct. As Marilyn walked, Sutcliffe pulled up close by and asked if she was doing business. They agreed on the price of £5 and she hopped into his vehicle. Before long, they were driving to a quiet place that Sutcliffe knew, and Marilyn got a very good look at the man as she sat next to him in the passenger seat. She was quite nervous in Sutcliffe's presence because she had never seen him before, and by now the Yorkshire Ripper case had become national news. Everyone knew about it. She questioned him about his name and why he was on Leupold Street, to which Sutcliffe responded that his name was Dave and that he was visiting a sick girlfriend. Marilyn was still not convinced by this, so he also added that he knew two local prostitutes called Hilary and Gloria, and that Hilary had a Jamaican boyfriend. This seemed to reassure Marilyn, given that she was friends with both of the women that he had mentioned. The pair drove to an abandoned mill on bustling Thrope Lane and headed for the abandoned lot behind it. They were a little over 150 metres from the playing fields where Sutcliffe had murdered Wilma McCann a couple years earlier. Once the vehicle had stopped, Sutcliffe suggested that they get into the back seat, and Marilyn agreed. When she went to open the door, she found it to be locked. Sutcliffe came around and offered to help, but when he got close, he swung at Marilyn's head with a hammer instead. Luckily for Marilyn, he slipped as he swung and only hit her with a glancing blow. This still caused her to fall to the ground, but she wasn't knocked unconscious. As she fell, Marilyn began to put up her hands to protect her head and started screaming for help. Sutcliffe also started screaming, but for a much different reason. "Dirty prostitute bitch," he yelled as he continued to bash her head with the hammer. He hit her 8 times before Marilyn finally fell into unconsciousness. This is when Sutcliffe heard the dog barking and decided that he should probably leave. He had caused enough commotion by this point. He got in his car and fled the scene, leaving Marilyn badly injured but still alive. A little time passed and Marilyn came to her senses. She clumsily rose to her feet and staggered out of the abandoned yard, crying for help. As she searched for a phone box to call an ambulance, a couple happened to be walking past, a man and a woman. The woman stayed with her and tried to provide some comfort, whilst the man sprinted down the street in the direction of a phone that he was aware of. Eventually she was taken to Leeds Hospital for emergency surgery. Part of her skull had been compressed against her brain, and the surgeons needed to relieve the pressure or it could cause serious brain injury. After she was released from surgery, she was questioned by the police. However, the officers were worried that her description of the suspect might be inaccurate due to the severity of her head injuries, so she was also questioned again under hypnosis. The description she gave resulted in one of the most accurate photo fits to date. A photo fit is a reconstructed photo of a suspect made by combining images of multiple other people's facial features to hopefully create an accurate image of what a suspect might look like. She also gave a decent description of Sutcliffe's vehicle, though she got the make and model wrong. 37 days would pass, and on the night of the 21st of January 1981, a 21-year-old prostitute named Yvonne Pearson was facing prison time after being caught soliciting on multiple occasions. She was due to appear in court in only 5 days, but she was desperate for money, so at 9:30 p.m. she set out to earn some and left her children in the care of a 16-year-old neighbour. On the same night, Sutcliffe's parents had moved into a new home closer to the centre of Bingley. Sutcliffe himself and his brother Mick had offered to help them move their stuff to the new property, and afterwards they offered Peter a drink to relax after the hard day's work. He graciously turned down their offer, but gave no reason as to why. The father and brother assumed that Peter just wanted to get home to his wife, Sonia, as fast as possible, so the family all said their goodbyes and Peter hopped into his car to leave. Sutcliffe had other plans, however, and bypassed his home in Bradford in order to stalk his killing grounds. He headed to Lum Lane. When he arrived, he narrowly avoided a collision with another car that had backed out of an alley. The driver wasn't paying much attention to his surroundings. Sutcliffe was rather annoyed by this and pulled over to the side of the road for a moment to gather his thoughts. As he was pulled over, a young blonde woman approached his vehicle and tapped on the passenger side window. Sutcliffe rolled the window down and asked where she had appeared from, to which she responded, "It must just be good timing. Put it down to fate." They agreed on the standard price of £5 and she hopped into the vehicle, telling Sutcliffe that her name was Yvonne. Before long, the pair would drive into a piece of abandoned ground behind Drummond's Mill, where Sutcliffe's father worked. When they arrived, Yvonne got out of the car first, and Sutcliffe himself withdrew a heavy walling hammer from under his car seat before stepping out of the vehicle also. He immediately struck the 21-year-old in the side of the head, but as she fell to the floor, another car pulled into the area and parked up directly next to Sutcliffe's own vehicle. Thinking fast, the Yorkshire Ripper dragged Yvonne's still conscious body behind an abandoned sofa that was nearby, and tore a large handful of horsehair that was used to stuff the sofa out of it and rammed it deep into the girl's throat. He then pinched her nose shut in an attempt to stop her from making any noise. After a moment, he let go of her nose to check if she was still burning, and when he realised that she was, he once again pinched her nose shut. After what felt like hours to Sutcliffe, and must have felt like a lifetime to Yvonne, the car pulled away and drove off, and he began to relax once more. What he did next differed from all the other murders because he didn't use a knife or any kind of sharp object to finish his victim off. Instead, he began kicking her in the face and neck over and over again. He then began to stamp on her face and chest before jumping into the air and stamping down with both feet. When he was done, he dragged her lifeless corpse to some bushes before covering it with leaves and soil, and then marking the spot by covering that with the abandoned sofa. The following Monday, Yvonne was reported missing. It was immediately suspected that she may have been another victim of the Ripper. However, because she was due to appear in court soon, the possibility that she had gone into hiding was also a probable theory. The police sent officers to check different spots of derelict land in the area where she was last spotted, but nothing was found. Yvonne's body wouldn't be discovered until a dog walker noticed it just over 2 months later on Easter Sunday. When she was discovered, she had badly decomposed, and her face was beaten so badly that she was unrecognisable. Only 10 days would pass, and on the last day of January, a pair of 18-year-old prostitute twin sisters named Helen and Rita Ritker were trying to earn some money. The pair had a system that was designed to prevent any dangerous customers from hurting either of them. They would both go off with their customers at the same time, giving the men precisely 20 minutes each. After 20 minutes had passed, the two girls would meet back up with each other at some public toilets on Great Northern Street. Their plan was better than nothing, but it wasn't foolproof. Other prostitutes in the local area had a better system. They would work in pairs, and when one girl went off with a client, the other would write down the number plate of the car on a piece of paper. If the girl was returned safely, the piece of paper would be torn up, but if the girl didn't return, or came back harmed, they would give the piece of paper as evidence to the police. However, this system was also flawed, given that prostitution is illegal in the UK, and to hand in this evidence to the police would be rather self-incriminating. At about 9:10 PM, Rita saw her sister get into a dark-coloured car on the other side of the street to her, before she also got into a different vehicle with her own client. Helen was the first to return, and when she did, Sutcliffe, who had been patrolling the area, spotted her. He convinced Helen that there was time to have a quick session in a local timber yard. Helen got into the car, and the pair made their way over. Sutcliffe planned to use his normal method of attack upon arrival. As Helen's back was turned to him, he swung a hammer down at her head, but it caught the roof of his car and only glanced at her. Helen yelped, thinking he had punched her, and blurted out, "Please sir, there's no need for that, you don't even have to pay." Sutcliffe's face spread into an evil grin before he said, "That was only a small sample of one of these," before repeatedly smashing her full force over the back of the head. As he was doing this, he realised that he was in full view of two parked up taxi drivers, but that they were oblivious to what was going on. Helen was laid on the floor and began making a moaning sound. Sutcliffe dragged her to the end of the yard, behind a large wood pile, and realised that she wasn't yet incapacitated. Her eyes had come back open, and she was trying to defend herself by raising her hands up above her head. Sutcliffe told her that it would all be okay if she would just keep quiet and Helen stop making noise. He thought that the only way to convince her to stay quiet would be to go through with the act, so he undid his trousers and raped the semi-conscious woman. Helen was the only victim that he had intercourse with. By the time he was done, he noticed that the taxi drivers were now gone, and he returned to his car to once more grab the hammer, as well as a knife that he had prepared. By this point, Helen had staggered to her feet and, clearly not in the right state of mind, began to slowly shuffle her way back towards the car. Sutcliffe attacked her again with the hammer, but still failed to kill her. He then dragged her back behind the log pile and stabbed her in the heart and lungs. Rita, Helen's sister, had returned to their spot outside the public toilets on Great Northern Street and began to wait for her. However, after a while, when it became obvious that her twin sister was not going to return, she made her way back to her flat and burst out into tears. It took Rita 3 days to report her sister as missing. The morning after the murder, a pool of blood was spotted by one of the workers at the yard and the police were called in. A police dog located Helen's body, hidden under a sheet of asbestos. After talking to Rita, it became obvious that Helen was another of the Ripper's victims. Sutcliffe would take his longest break from killing in over a year, but after 104 days, he became restless and decided it was time to kill again. Not many details are known about this next incident, but I'll do my best to cover as much as possible. On Tuesday the 6th of May, a 40-year-old prostitute named Vera Millwood left her flat in Manchester to wait outside for her regular customer, a man who usually turned up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On this particular night, however, the man never showed up. When she realised he wasn't going to appear, Vera started to walk up the road to another spot that she knew. Eventually, Sutcliffe happened upon her, offered her business, and she got into his car with him. She directed him to a location outside of Manchester Royal Infirmary, a hospital where prostitutes and their clients were known to visit. Sutcliffe followed his normal routine when it came to ending women's lives and struck her in the back of the head as she tried to enter the back door of his car. The man who was in the area at the time said that he heard 3 screams, but decided not to investigate since he thought it was more likely that it came from a patient inside of the hospital. Sutcliffe killed her with the hammer, dragged her body behind a fence, and began to stab the corpse with his knife. Vera's body was discovered shortly after 8 AM the next morning by some gardeners who had come to do work on the hospital grounds. Her death was particularly violent, with small pieces of brain having fallen out of her skull and dried to her clothes overnight. The gardeners thought that she had been shot in the face with a shotgun. The police caught a break in the investigation at the scene of this crime when they discovered tyre tracks in the mud. They were able to take casts of all 4 tyres and narrowed the list of suspect vehicles down to only 11 possible cars, including Sutcliffe's own red Ford Corsair. Sutcliffe wouldn't attack anyone else in 1978, and Vera was also the last victim of the Ripper that was a known prostitute. During later police interviews, Sutcliffe told investigators that after killing Millwood, the urge to kill seemed to fade away for a long time. However, when it returned, he no longer only wanted to kill prostitutes. He wanted to kill any woman at any time. He thought that this would eventually get him caught, but he also thought that maybe, subconsciously, this is what he wanted all along, to kill any woman. On Friday the 2nd of March, 1979, a 22-year-old college student named Anne Rooney was attacked from behind on the grounds of her college at Horsforth in Leeds. She was hit on the back of the head 3 times with a hammer, but she did survive. She was taken to the infirmary and examined by Professor David G., who informed her that a hammer was used in the attack. When questioned by the police, Rooney described her attacker as being in his mid to late 20s, about 5 foot 10 inches tall, with dark and curly hair and a mustache. She also mentioned that she believed that before the attack, she had seen a man sitting in a dark-coloured sunbeam rapier. Peter Sutcliffe was the owner of a black sunbeam rapier, which had been flagged by police numerous times going through red light areas of Leeds and Bradford. Because he had been spotted 3 times in these areas, he was to be called in for an interview as a possible suspect in the Ripper case. There are 850 sunbeam vehicles listed in the Punter's Index. 21 sunbeam rapiers were cross-area sightings, meaning that they had been flagged in 2 of the 6 red light areas under observation. Only 3, including Peter Sutcliffe's own vehicle, had been flagged as having triple area sightings. Unfortunately, The officers involved in the investigation into the attack on Anne Rooney were unaware of the importance of the data that was available in the system. Police decided that this attack couldn't have been committed by the Ripper based purely on the fact that the hammer was too small, and the Ripper used a bigger hammer. In hindsight, this sounds ridiculous. Sutcliffe was known to have used multiple different types of hammers during the course of his crimes. 33 days later, the Ripper would strike again, this time successfully killing his first well-respected woman who had no knowledge of prostitution. By this point, the police had mounted a very large presence in any red light district known to be part of the Ripper's hunting grounds. Facing mounting public pressure, they were becoming more desperate to catch the serial killer before he could claim any more victims. On the night of the 4th of April, Sutcliffe travelled to Halifax. He didn't want to attempt any more murders in his normal hunting grounds until the police presence had died down. He met up with one of his old neighbours so that they could go for drinks and spent the night in a local pub. On the same night, 19-year-old Josephine Whittaker was visiting her grandparents. She was a good granddaughter and often liked to visit the elderly couple, as she had done since she was a young lass. She showed them a new silver watch that she had recently bought for £60, which would be about £400 or $525 in modern money, and the couple invited her to spend the night since it was late and they didn't want her to walk home alone. Unfortunately for the beautiful young woman, she had left her contact lenses at home and had work the next day. Because of this, she insisted on walking alone, and at about 11:40 PM, she left her grandparents' residence in order to walk using a route that would take her through Savile Park. 10 minutes earlier, Sutcliffe had dropped his friend off at his home, having finished their night of drinks, and drove off in the opposite direction. He drove to the playing fields and then began circling Savile Park in his Sunbeam Rapier, which is when he spotted Josephine walking alone. When he noticed her, he quickly pulled up and parked his car. Reaching under the driver's seat, he withdrew a large hammer and a new custom-made weapon that he had made himself. This was a large Phillips screwdriver that he had sharpened at the end. He hopped out of his vehicle and began to quickly follow the 19-year-old, catching up to her in a minute or two. Upon reaching the young lady, he struck up a conversation, asking if she had far to walk. She told him that she had just left her grandparents' home and that she did indeed have a distance to walk. She was grateful for the company, and the pair continued the walk towards Josephine's parents' house. As they walked further into the park, Josephine informed Sutcliffe that she normally took a shortcut through the field. Sutcliffe was surprised by this, and ominously responded with, "Wow, that's dangerous. You never know who you can trust these days." They walked through the field, and when they walked out of range of the streetlights, he asked her if she had the time. Josephine looked over the trees at the edge of the park to a clock tower and gave it to him. This is when Sutcliffe marvelled at her good eyesight, being able to read the clock from that distance, and began to lag a little bit behind, pretending to be trying to read the clock himself. In reality, however, he was removing his hammer from his jacket pocket. When Josephine turned her back to continue walking, the Ripper struck, smashing the back of her skull with her ball-peen hammer. She fell to the ground and made a quiet whimpering sound. Sutcliffe then kneeled above her and swung down a few more times with the hammer. Whilst he was doing this, he noticed a couple walking in the same spot where he and Josephine had just passed a few moments earlier, and decided to drag the young lady approximately 30 feet to a darker area of the park. When he arrived, he was horrified to hear two people running just behind him. His heart jumped out of his chest when they passed just meters by him, but somehow they saw nothing. After the people had passed, Sutcliffe noticed that his victim was still whimpering and ripped her clothes off. He then used his sharpened screwdriver to stab her 21 times in the chest, 6 times in the leg, and then once in the vagina. Her skull was completely cracked from ear to ear. At 6:30 AM the next day, Josephine's body was discovered by Jean Markham, a woman who was passing by. At first, the police thought that she was the victim of a hit and run, and had managed to drag herself to where she was later discovered. However, after investigating, the police realised that she was actually a murder victim. Upon further examination, it became clear that the Yorkshire Ripper had returned, having laid dormant for 322 days. Police found traces of metal fragments inside the stab wounds on Josephine's chest, and this led them to believe that the killer may have been employed in some kind of metalworking industry. In reality, it is most likely that these fragments came from the screwdriver after Sutcliffe had sharpened the end. Police efforts were also diverted for several months at this point. Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield of the West Yorkshire Police Force had received a taped message taunting him for not being able to catch the Ripper. I will play the tape for you now.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. They can't be much good, can they? The only time they came near catching me was a few months back in Chapeltown, when I was disturbed. I warned you in March that I'd strike again. Sorry it wasn't Bradford. I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again, but it will be definitely sometime this year. I'm not sure where. Maybe Manchester. I like it there. There's plenty of them knocking about. They never learn, do they, George? I bet you've warned them, but they never listen. Well, it's been nice chatting to you, George. Yours, Jack the Ripper.
The police and the Daily Mail, a British news publication, also received 2 letters supposedly from the Yorkshire Ripper, once again taunting them for not being able to catch him. The letters were both signed Jack the Ripper and claimed responsibility for the 1975 murder of 26-year-old Joan Harrison in Preston, Lancashire. The tape recording and both letters were fakes, authored by a man known as Wearside Jack, and the murder was not in fact committed by the Yorkshire Ripper. Wearside Jack would eventually be caught by police in 2005 when it was revealed that he was actually called John Humble. He was charged with perverting the course of justice and was sentenced to 9 years in prison in 2006. Under British law, anyone in prison with a sentence of under 10 years can be released early after only serving half their sentence if they demonstrate good behaviour whilst incarcerated. Humble was released after serving 4 years. Barbara Leach was a 20-year-old university student who was studying her 3rd and final year of social psychology. On the 2nd of September 1979, her and a few friends were helping the landlord of the local Manville Arms pub in Bradford collect empty bottles after closing time. He rewarded them with a free drink even though the pub was closed, before the group of girls left at around 12:45 AM. There was a light rain that night, and Barbara decided she wanted to go for a night walk to get some fresh air. None of her friends wanted to join her because of the rain, so she went alone. Peter Sutcliffe happened to be driving through the area at the time and saw the group of friends going their separate ways. He quickly drove just past Barbara and then pulled into their left on a street just a few meters ahead. As he got out of the car, Barbara was walking past him. He let her walk ahead and then came up behind her and attacked with a hammer. She was immediately knocked out cold, leaving Sutcliffe free to drag her into a random back garden of someone's house. When he got her there, he used the same sharpened screwdriver that he had used to end Josephine's life a few months earlier to brutally stab the young woman. When he was done, he dragged the body into a corner and covered it with a carpet. He then placed some heavy stones on top to prevent it blowing away in the wind. The next evening, Barbara's friends reported her missing as she still had not returned from her walk. On the Monday, police began a search of the area where she was last seen, and at 3:55 PM, Police Constable Simon Greaves found her body where Sutcliffe had hidden it, about 150 meters from where she had left her friends. Her wounds, similar to the wounds received by Josephine Whittaker, clearly indicated to the police that the Yorkshire Ripper had struck once more. The public pressure to find the Ripper had grown to an immense level following these most 2 recent murders, seeing as how the Ripper had graduated from killing prostitutes and was now killing upstanding members of society. Now, every woman in the north of England feared going out at night. The police had paid for an expensive publicity campaign emphasizing the fact that the killer had a Wearside accent, as they had not yet figured out the tape and the letters were in fact a hoax. Despite the false lead, Sutcliffe was actually interviewed 2 different times in 1979. Even though he had been interviewed by the police multiple times, spotted in the area following multiple murders, and been on the list of 300 suspects who were connected to the new £5 note from Jean's murder in Manchester, somehow Sutcliffe was still not considered to be a strong suspect. The Yorkshire Ripper would take another long break from killing after this last murder, probably spooked from the multiple police interviews within 1 year. On the 26th of June 1980, Sutcliffe was stopped whilst driving because he had been swerving around. He was tested for drunk driving and the test came back positive. He was then released under investigation, with a court date set for sometime in mid-January 1981. As he awaited his trial, almost 1 full year after his last killing, Sutcliffe would begin his search for his next victim. Marguerite Walls was a 47-year-old civil servant who worked at the Department of Education and Science in Pudsey, a small town on the outskirts of Leeds. On the 20th of August, she had been working overtime because she was leaving for a 10-day holiday the next morning and wanted to make as much money as she could before she left. She left her office between 9:30 and 10:30 PM to walk the short distance back to her home in Farsley, a village that connected to Pudsey. As she was doing this, Peter Sutcliffe is driving through the village on his way to Chapeltown when he spotted Marguerite walking towards him. He overtook her and then laid in wait behind a stone wall that she was sure to walk past, and just before she reached the wall, he sprung out and began bashing her skull in with a hammer. He was in a murderous rage, screaming obscenities at the dying woman, calling her a filthy prostitute as he struck her again and again. She wasn't dead yet, but was in no condition to flee. Sutcliffe knew that she wouldn't be able to escape, so he returned to his car and retrieved a length of rope which he tied around her neck and then dragged the barely breathing woman into a random nearby garden. Once inside, he knelt down on her chest with one knee and began to strangle her. Eventually she expired, and he stripped all of her clothes but didn't cut or stab at the body. He then hid her underneath a pile of leaves and fled the scene. The body was discovered the next morning by 2 gardeners, and the police were called to the scene. Upon forensic examination, the officers determined that this was not the work of the Ripper. The use of a ligature, as well as the lack of stab wounds, were obvious differences to all of Sutcliffe's previous attacks. The police announced to the public that they thought this was the work of a new, different killer, and that the Yorkshire Ripper was still in dormancy. 35 days would pass, with Sutcliffe searching for a new victim every single night. Eventually he found what he was looking for, a 34-year-old doctor from Singapore called Upadhyaya Bandara. On the night of Wednesday the 24th of September, after an evening of relaxing with some friends, Bandara was walking home alone through Hindley in Leeds. She was walking past a KFC fast food place when she noticed a man staring at her for an uncomfortably long time. She took little notice of this, however, and cut through an alleyway that led to Cardigan Road. As she was walking through the alley, she moved to the side to let someone pass, but instead was struck over the head twice and knocked unconscious. Sutcliffe had come up behind her and, just like with all the other victims, struck her with a hammer. When she had fallen to the floor, he wrapped a rope around her neck and began to drag her through the alley. As he was doing this, her shoes started scraping against the floor, making a loud sound, so he removed them, threw them to one side, before continuing to drag her. A resident of one of the houses that connected to the alley, named Miss Valerie Nichols, heard the scraping sound and came into her garden to investigate. Once she realised what was going on, she ran back inside of the house to phone the police. This spooked Sutcliffe, and he ran away without finishing the job. Luckily, Valerie had saved Bandara's life. When she regained consciousness, she sat up to find a police officer standing over her. This officer had arrived on the scene mere seconds after Sutcliffe had fled. He decided to stay and help the victim, rather than to search for the suspect, since he wasn't sure if Bandara was going to make it or not. Before she had lost consciousness, she had seen her attacker and described him as about age 25, 5 foot 4 inches tall, with black hair, a full beard and a mustache. Due to the lack of any stab wounds and the use of a ligature, the attack was not considered to be a Ripper attack. The attack was, however, linked to the murder of Marguerite Walsh, and the police believed that they had a new serial killer to contend with. No other incidents would take place until the 5th of November, Bonfire Night, a holiday in England that celebrates a failed plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament in the early 1600s. On this holiday, bonfires are lit and fireworks displays are held in every town across the country. All the commotion would make this the perfect time to commit a crime, and that is exactly what Peter Sutcliffe thought too. Teresa Sykes was a 16-year-old girl who had just bought some cigarettes from a small corner store and was heading home to get ready to go out and join in on the celebrations. As she walked, she cut through a small path along a grassy embankment and into the darkness, where Sutcliffe was waiting for her. After she passed him without noticing his presence, he emerged from the shadows, crept up behind, and began to attack the same way he had done over a dozen times before. He brought the hammer down on the back of her head, but Teresa wouldn't be made a victim as easily as the others before her. As she fell, she turned and grabbed the hammer while screaming for help. Sutcliffe pried her fingers away from the weapon and pushed her to the ground, before smashing her once in the forehead. The commotion attracted the attention of her boyfriend, who came rushing to the scene, scaring Sutcliffe away. I am not surprised at all to hear that a coward who preys on helpless women and teenage girls could be scared away by a 16-year-old boy. The lad is a hero. A neighbour called Jim Fury, who also heard the screams, came sprinting to Teresa's aid just behind her boyfriend. He noticed Sutcliffe disappearing into the distance and decided to give pursuit. Jim was a professional sprinter and quickly caught up to the spot where he had last seen Sutcliffe and continued giving chase further down the path. The Yorkshire Ripper was unbelievably lucky because he had not realised that he was being chased and by chance decided to hide in a bush instead of continuing to sprint into the night. If he had carried on running, he almost certainly would have been caught and apprehended by Fury, who passed the bush that he was hiding in. Eventually, Sutcliffe emerged, having come the closest he ever would be to getting caught red-handed. At first, this attack was also not thought to be connected to the Yorkshire Ripper, but later, when presented with new evidence, the police would change their opinion. The final Ripper victim was 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill. Jackie was a third-year student who was studying to get an English degree and who was returning home to a student accommodation in Headingley in Leeds. Monday the 17th of November was a wet and rainy day, the kind of day you picture when you imagine England in your head. Jackie had just been at the Leeds city centre attending a seminar which was held by a probation officer, and at 9 PM that evening she caught a bus which she rode all the way back to her residence. She disembarked the bus at 9:23 at a stop that was less than 100 metres from her front door. This was the same location that the attempt on Bondara's life was made only 7 weeks prior. As she disembarked the bus, the Yorkshire Ripper sat in a parked car eating a bucket of KFC, watching her closely. Something made him decide that she would be his next victim, so he placed the bucket down on the passenger seat next to him and turned on the ignition to his car. He drove past Jackie and then pulled up in a free spot on the side of the road that she was bound to walk past. After she did, he stepped out of his vehicle, hammer in one hand and screwdriver in the other, and struck her over the back of the head. As he did this, another woman began walking down the same street in the direction of the pair. This woman didn't notice what was happening. Sutcliffe hoisted Jackie into a standing position before carrying her onto some undeveloped land behind a nearby shopping centre or mall before dropping her onto the floor. He checked his surroundings to make sure that nobody was watching, and when he was satisfied that they weren't, he went to work on the unconscious girl. He began stabbing her repeatedly in the chest using the screwdriver, and then once in her eyeball. Just under an hour later, some students happened upon some of Jacqueline's discarded belongings at the site where Sutcliffe had initially attacked her, including her bag. Upon further examination, they noticed some blood spatter on the bag and decided to call the police. When the police turned up to investigate, they performed a quick 3-minute search of the area, failing to find either Jackie's glasses or gloves, which were also lost in the attack, nor her body. It wasn't until the next morning, when a manager of one of the stores in the shopping centre happened to look over a wall that Jackie's corpse was discovered. Another month and a half would pass before Sutcliffe felt the urge to kill once more. After arguing with his wife, he informed her that he needed to go pick up the key to his sister's car because it had supposedly broken down. He left the house sometime around 4 PM, but the story about his sister was a fabrication. Instead of driving to Bingley like he had told Sonia, he actually drove to a scrapyard on the outskirts of Leeds. When he got there, he found an old car, a Skoda, and stole the number plates from it. He covered his own number plates with the stolen ones and then started cruising for a new victim. Eventually, he came across a prostitute called Olivia Reevers, who told him that she would only do business with him for £10 and if it was in the car. Sutcliffe also had to agree to wear a condom. When she got into the car, Sutcliffe drove her half a mile to Melbourne Avenue and parked in the driveway of the Light Trades house. He dimmed the lights of the car and Reevers asked for the payment up front. Sutcliffe agreed and handed her a £10 note. They spent a while talking, but before Sutcliffe could carry out his plan, a police car pulled up into the same driveway. Inside were 2 police officers, PC Robert Hyde and Sergeant Robert Ring. They knew that this was a favourite spot for prostitutes and their clients, so they hopped out of their car and walked over to Sutcliffe's. Sutcliffe told Reevers to stay calm and to let him handle the situation, but he was unaware of the fact that Reevers was well known to the police. Another thing that Sutcliffe was unaware of was that the police had been ordered to take any man found in the company of a prostitute in for questioning by the Ripper Squad. This order was as a result of the mounting public pressure to find the Ripper. Sutcliffe blurted out an obviously untrue story that Reevers was his girlfriend, and when questioned as to the name of his girlfriend, Sutcliffe responded that he didn't know. This was extremely suspicious to the 2 officers, as it would be to anyone else, so as Hyde continued to question Sutcliffe, Ring returned to his police vehicle. He radioed back to the police headquarters with a request to look up Sutcliffe's number plates and realised that they actually belonged to a Skoda. Sutcliffe, however, was sitting inside of a Rover. The 2 officers then escorted Reevers to the back of their car. Whilst this was going on, Sutcliffe immediately realised what was about to happen and grabbed the hammer, screwdriver and knife from under his car seat. He quickly stepped out of the vehicle as the officers were preoccupied with the prostitute and began to quickly walk out of sight. One of the officers noticed this and called out to Sutcliffe, asking where he thought he was going. Sutcliffe told them that he was bursting for a pee, and then the officers gave him permission to relieve himself. He stepped around the corner, out of view of the police officers, and saw a large oil storage tank. He quickly placed the tools behind it and covered them with some leaves. He then returned. The officers placed him in the back of the police car with Reevers and drove both to the station to be questioned. At the station, the questioning began. Sutcliffe explained that he had stolen the plates because he had been caught driving drunk a few months earlier and was due to be seen in court in about 2 weeks. His insurance had run out and it wasn't worth renewing it when he was about to receive a driving ban, so he just stole the number plates instead. After this quick interview, he was left to sleep in the cell for the night, and at 8 AM the next morning, he was transported to Dewsbury Police Station to be questioned by the Ripper Squad. He was mostly calm and cooperative until he was asked to give a blood sample. They tested it against the bloody palm print found at He was mostly calm and cooperative until he was asked to give a blood sample. They tested it against the bloody palm print found on the broken piece of ceramic from the Maureen Long crime scene, and the blood type was not a match. The interviewing officer was prepared to release Sutcliffe once again after this. However, one officer went and complained to his supervisor, who agreed that Sutcliffe was still an extremely likely suspect. They swapped out the interviewing officer for a more senior one and continued to question him. Word got back to Sergeant Ring that Sutcliffe was still being questioned by the Ripper Squad over 24 hours after they had initially arrested him, and he suddenly remembered that Sutcliffe had disappeared for a moment, saying that he needed to pee. It was then that he decided to head back to the scene of the arrest and check the area where Sutcliffe disappeared from view. After a few minutes of looking, he discovered the Yorkshire Ripper's tools. Due to this discovery, the police were able to obtain a search warrant for the Sutcliffe's home. They also took Sonia in for questioning and showed her a photo of the knife that they had found behind the storage tank. Sonia confirmed that it was her own knife, which she had bought many years ago, before her marriage with Peter. After interviewing Sonia, the Ripper Squad's questioning of Peter Sutcliffe intensified dramatically. By this point, all officers involved were sure that they had their man. While Sutcliffe was calm and cooperative at first, after 2 days of non-stop intense questioning, he finally broke, and on the afternoon of the 4th of January 1981, he suddenly admitted that he was in fact the Yorkshire Ripper. Over the next day, he coldly described many of his attacks. Some the police were unaware of, and others they hadn't connected to the Ripper case. The only time he showed any emotion or regret was when he spoke of the murder of his youngest victim, Jane Macdonald. A few weeks later, he claimed that God had told him to murder the women because they were filthy prostitutes who littered the streets. He also admitted to attacking 2 more victims. However, details of these crimes were never released to the public because both victims survived and wished to remain anonymous. Sutcliffe went to trial that May, and after a 3-week trial, the jury deliberated for only 5 hours. The jury found Sutcliffe guilty with a majority of 10-2. Sutcliffe was sentenced to 13 consecutive life sentences with a recommended minimum term of 30 years, meaning it was actually possible that he could be released in the year 2011. However, in 2010, his sentence was changed to a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. Sutcliffe declined to appeal his change in sentence and remained locked up until 2020, when he died of coronavirus during the worldwide pandemic. Before I end this video, I just want to say that the support for this channel has been absolutely mind-blowing, and I feel obligated to thank you all for viewing the videos, and especially for subscribing. We have gone from 0 to 100 subscribers in only 2 weeks. I wrote this a while ago. We're much past 100 subscribers now. We're almost at 1,000. And I've already surpassed the milestone after I wrote this a while ago, guys, and we've already surpassed milestone after milestone. My first attempt at a true documentary style video has already racked up multiple thousands of views, and I'm just blown away by how well we are doing. None of this would be possible without you guys, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you made it to this point of the video, then please remember to give it a like, and if you are new here, then subscribe to the channel. Doing this lets YouTube know that people enjoy the video, and then they promote it to more people, helping the channel grow and motivate me to make more content. Making content like this takes a very, very long time. Not just editing the video itself, but also doing the research and writing the script alone could take up to a week. It may sound silly, but I don't think I have ever worked this hard on anything in my life, so once again, please remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below too. It would be awesome to have a discussion with people about what they thought of this case, because I know that the Yorkshire Ripper is not so well known outside of the UK. I read and respond to every comment as well, so if you do have any questions or would like to discuss the case at all, make sure you drop one down below, and also make sure you check out the other videos on my channel. This is actually the second video in the series, and I plan to make many more after this one as well. So other than that, yeah, thank you for watching. I appreciate it a lot, and I will see you next time.
I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go sit, but sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody...
On the 4th of February 1983, a London man wrote a letter to his estate agent, complaining that the drains in his flat were blocked and that the situation for him and other tenants in the building had become too bad to handle. This was an incredibly foolish mistake, made by a deranged killer who had heartlessly preyed on over 20 young men and boys in the previous 5 years and flushed the remains down his toilet. In today's video, we will be discussing a truly horrific case of Britain's most prolific at the time serial killer, Dennis Nilsen, also known as the Kindly Killer. We will be exploring the depths of his depraved mind, as well as the reason why he decided to take the actions that he did. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in the beautiful county of Aberdeenshire in Scotland. He was the middle child and had two siblings, an older brother and a younger sister. He was described as a quiet but adventurous child, nothing like the man he would grow to become. Nilsen's earliest childhood memories were of family picnics in the Scottish countryside with his mother and siblings, as well as being taken on long countryside walks with his grandfather, who he described as his great hero and as his protector. These were the happiest moments of the young boy's life, a life that would result in misery and death for many of the men who he would later interact with. By the time Nilsen was 6 in 1951, his grandfather's health had begun to deteriorate, but he continued to earn a living as a fisherman, knowing that he needed to support his family, including his daughter and his grandchildren, who still lived at home with him and his wife. On October the 31st of the same year, whilst working out at sea, he suffered a massive heart attack and passed away at the age of 62. His body was brought ashore and the family was informed. The news devastated the entire family, but nobody took this news as hard as Nilsen's mother. In what Nilsen would later describe as his most vivid childhood memory, his mother, crying so hard that he thought her eyes might fall out, asked the young Dennis if he wanted to see his grandfather so that he may say his goodbyes. As Nilsen gazed upon the body, the image was burnt into his mind, leaving an imprint that he would never forget. His mother told him that his grandfather was now sleeping and that his soul had gone to a better place. Nilsen felt lost after losing his only hero and role model, and in the years following the death of his grandfather, Nilsen could often be found alone at the harbour, watching the other fishing boats going out to sea and later returning. He became much more quiet and withdrawn, not being particularly close to any of his other family members. Eventually Nilsen would grow closer to his younger sister, Sylvia, and found comfort talking to her or playing games with her. This never filled the hole that was left in his heart after his grandfather's passing, but it provided some comfort to the young boy and kept his sister entertained, so he saw it as a worthwhile way to spend his time. A few years passed, and Nilsen continued his lonely trips to the harbour, trying to catch a glimpse of any fishing vessels. On one particular trip, Nilsen somehow became submerged under the water and was almost dragged out to sea by a strong current that he was not strong enough to swim against. Luckily for him, another young boy saw what had happened and managed to bring him ashore. Eventually Nilsen's mother moved out of her parents' home and into a flat with her 3 children, soon finding love in the arms of a builder named Andrew Scott and having 4 more children with him. By the time Nilsen hit puberty, he had a world-altering realization when it became obvious to him that he was attracted to men and not women. Nilsen found this incredibly shameful and confusing, and so he decided to keep his sexuality hidden from all of his family members and what few friends he did have. Nilsen spent a lot of time thinking about this and came to a realization. Many of the boys that he had felt an attraction towards had similar facial features to his sister. In his already twisted young mind, he convinced himself that his feelings must have been a manifestation of the love and care that he truly felt for his younger sister, and he decided to her to find out if this was true. It is unreported if he was ever actually caught doing this. At a later date, he also caressed and the body of his older brother, Olaf Jr., as he slept, waking him and sending him into a rage. Olaf began to think that his younger brother was gay, leading him to bullying the young Nilsen and never missing an opportunity to embarrass him. It must have been a truly revolting thing to wake up to. At the age of 14, Nilsen joined the Army Cadet Force, a club hosted by the British Army for teenagers to learn about the history, culture, and structure of life for a soldier in the real army. As a side note, I myself also joined the Army Cadet Force in my teenage years. Nilsen viewed the army as a possible escape from the Scottish countryside that he had grown up in, and desperately wanted to move away from. After the young lad finished school in 1961, he found employment working in a canning factory. He used this time to think about what career he wanted for himself, and tried his hardest to reflect on what he wanted to achieve in his life. After 3 weeks, he had made up his mind. Returning home one day, he told his mother that he planned on joining the British Army and to receive training as a chef. Nobody was surprised to hear this, given his previous love of the Army Cadet Force. Nilsen enlisted for 9 years' service in September 1961 and started his training with the Army Catering Corps at St. Omer Barracks in Aldershot, Hampshire. He immediately excelled in his duties both as a soldier and as a chef, later describing his year's training as the best times of his life. While stationed at Aldershot, Nilsen's homosexual tendencies once again began to stir in his mind, but he kept this a secret from his colleagues for fear of ridicule and discrimination. He refused to shower with his fellow soldiers for fear of getting an erection in front of them, and instead opted to use the bathroom on his own. The bathroom door had a lock, and Nilsen took advantage of this to the fullest, using his bathing sessions as an opportunity to masturbate. In the year 1964, Nilsen passed his catering exam and was officially assigned to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, West Germany. During this deployment, Nilsen became quite the heavy drinker. His colleagues noticed his increase in the use of alcohol and chalked it up to him drinking to get over his shyness. On one occasion, Nilsen met a young German boy, and they both drank until they passed out. The next day, Nilsen awoke with a pounding headache on the floor of the German's flat. They had not engaged in sex, but this incident fueled his sexual fantasies regardless. Starting from this point forward, Nilsen's fantasies always revolved around a younger, skinnier male, being completely passive and allowing Nilsen to do whatever he wanted to him. The fantasies gradually evolved into something much, much darker when he began imagining a partner to be either unconscious or dead. Following this, Nilsen made many efforts to have himself be sexually assaulted by one of his colleagues, and whenever he would drink with the other lads, he would pretend to be passed out in the hopes that one of them would make use of his supposedly unconscious body. After being deployed in West Germany for 2 years, Nilsen was eventually transferred to serve as a cook in Norway, and a year later to the state of Aden, a part of modern-day Yemen.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic.
This deployment was far more dangerous than anywhere he had been posted before, and Nilsen recalled losing a couple of men in ambushes on the way back to the barracks. On one occasion, Nilsen himself was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver who took pleasure in beating him into unconsciousness. Nilsen was placed in the boot of the taxi and driven to a secluded location. As Nilsen was dragged out of the boot, surely to his death, he grabbed a jackhammer that he had found in the darkness. He used this tool to attack the taxi driver, knocking him to the ground before handing out a savage beating, leaving the taxi driver unrecognizable but alive. He then locked the Arab in the boot of the car that he himself had only just narrowly escaped from, and drove himself back to the barracks, mostly uninjured. It is unknown what happened to the taxi driver after this incident, but I'll have to assume that he was detained in the nearby British-owned Al Mansoura prison. In Nilsen's previous postings, he had shared sleeping quarters with other soldiers, but in Aden, Nilsen had his own room. Once again, just like in the bathroom during his training years, this gave him the opportunity to freely masturbate without the risk of being caught. This led him to realize that he could use a freestanding mirror to assist in visualizing himself engaged in homosexual acts with another man. He would swap between fantasies of being a dominant and passive partner. These fantasies began to involve some truly insidious stuff, such as his own near-death experience with a taxi driver, as well as the dead bodies that he had seen in Aden, and a 19th century oil painting known as the Raft of the Medusa, which shows an old man sitting atop the dismembered corpse of a man, whilst holding the limp body of a dead youth. In his personal favourite fantasy, Nilsen imagined the corpse of a young blonde soldier who had been recently killed in battle, being dominated by a dirty, dishevelled, grey-haired old man. The man washed it before having sex with the corpse. When Nilsen's deployment in Aden came to an end, he returned to the UK and was assigned to serve with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders at the Seaton Barracks in Plymouth, Devon. Another side note, Plymouth is my home city. Nilsen stayed at the Plymouth Barracks for only 1 year, before his unit was sent to Cyprus in 1969, and then a few months later to Berlin. During his Berlin deployment, Nilsen had his first and last consensual sexual experience with a woman, a prostitute that he had paid for. In 1971, he was reassigned to the Shetland Islands, the northernmost point of the UK, located 100 miles northeast of mainland Scotland and 140 miles west of Norway. This is where he ended his 11-year career with the military at the rank of corporal in October 1972.
Batteries had run out, that's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough. If you think you know how to use it, all you do is point it down and press a button.
Between October and December 1972, Nilsen lived with his family whilst he thought about what to do with his life following the army. One day he joined his older brother Olav, his sister-in-law and another couple to watch a documentary about gay marriage, which was outlawed in the UK at the time. Everyone present finished the presentation feeling disgusted and that their religion had been disrespected. Nilsen, however, argued in favour of gay rights. This led to a violent confrontation between Olav and himself, culminating in Olav telling his mother that Dennis was a homosexual and about the fondling incident from their childhood. After this, Nilsen split away from his family, never again speaking to Olav and only keeping occasional written correspondence with his other family members, even including his own mother. He decided he wanted to join the London Metropolitan Police Force and moved to the city in December to begin the training course. In April 1973, Nilsen completed his training and was posted to Willesden Green. By August, after a failed relationship, Nilsen began to wonder whether his personal lifestyle was compatible with that of his job. During the same month, his birth father died and left an inheritance of £1,000 to each of his 3 children, which would be about £10,500 in 2024 money, about $16,000 US. In December of that year, Nilsen resigned from the police force, having served only a few months, and found employment working as a security guard. He worked this job until May 1974, when he found work as a civil servant. This role had him working in a job centre in Denmark Street. Over 4 years passed, and by late 1978, Nilsen was living a solitary existence. He had experienced at least 4 failed relationships in the last 4 years, 3 of which were in the last 18 months, and he realised that he was unfit for someone to live with. Throughout 1978, he had begun to spend almost all of his time at work, and had become an alcoholic, binging on spirits every night as he listened to music. His mental state had slipped even further into the depraved, and he began to fantasize about killing a young man so that he could keep the body for himself.
Anything good you find in this kitchen is probably attributed to my having purchased it in the first place. Bloody light doesn't even go on. Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
As the year was coming to a close, on the 30th of December, Nilsen finally snapped. He encountered a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes at the Cricklewood Arms pub, when Holmes was unsuccessfully attempting to purchase alcohol. Nilsen was drinking heavily and alone when he decided that he must leave his flat and seek a companion at any costs. Nilsen approached the teenage boy and invited him to his house with the promised alcohol. He supposedly believed the boy to be around 17 years old. Holmes accepted, a decision that would seal his fate. When the pair got back to Nilsen's residence, they both drank heavily before falling asleep. The next morning, Nilsen woke up before Holmes and began to caress and fondle the boy in his sleep. During this despicable act, Nilsen had a sinister thought. This boy is going to stay with me over the new year, whether he wants to or not. He reached for one of his neckties, before climbing on top of the still sleeping Holmes to prevent him from escaping if he woke up. He then wrapped the tie around his throat and tightened. He strangled him until he fell unconscious before drowning the teenager with a bucket that he had filled with water. This wasn't the end of Holmes' terrible ordeal, however, even though he was already dead. Nilsen proceeded to masturbate over the corpse 2 times and then left the body on his bed whilst he waited for rigor mortis to set in. He did this so that it would be easier to move the body, which he stashed under his floorboards. This would be Holmes' resting place for almost 8 entire months. During the summer months, the smell became unbearable, and on the 11th of August, Nilsen built a bonfire in the garden behind his flat and finally disposed of the corpse. A few months later, on the 11th of October, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met at a pub on St. Martin's Lane and lured to his house with the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who managed to break free and escape. Ho proceeded to report the incident to the police, and Nilsen was questioned about it. However, Ho changed his mind and decided not to press charges. His reasoning is unknown. 2 months after the failed murder attempt of Ho, on the 3rd of December 1979, Nilsen encountered 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Ockenden, who was in England to visit some relatives. The pair met as they both drank at the bar of a pub on the West End. After Nilsen learned that the young man was a tourist, he offered to show him several London landmarks. Ockenden accepted, and unwillingly placed his life in the hands of a murderous necrophiliac. After the tour was complete, Nilsen invited the student to his house, promising him a meal with some more drinks. When later questioned about the incident, Nilsen told the police that he couldn't remember the moment where he actually strangled Ockenden, but he did recall that he did it using the cord of his headphones, as Ockenden was listening to music. After the evil deed was done, Nilsen poured himself a half glass of rum and wore the headphones that he had just used to end the poor tourist's life. Nilsen went to sleep as if nothing had ever happened, and the next day he made a trip to a photography store. Inside, he purchased a Polaroid camera and then returned home. When he got back, he began to pose the victim's corpse in various locations around the flat, and he took suggestive photos of it. Monstrous behavior. When he was finally done taking photos, he then climbed into bed and laid the corpse on top of himself whilst he watched some TV. I can only wonder what kind of weird stuff this guy was watching with a dead body resting on top of him. After Nilsen grew bored of that, he decided it was time to put the body into his personal storage and stuffed it under the floorboards. He wasn't done with it though, far from it in fact. Over the next 2 weeks, Nilsen lifted the corpse from the floorboards and seated it in the armchair beside him whilst he drank and watched TV. Nilsen took a brief break, but he had definitely not retired. On the 17th of May, he encountered a 16-year-old boy named Martin Duffy, a catering student from Merseyside, who was homeless and sleeping rough on the streets of London. Duffy had hitchhiked to London without telling his parents about it. His reason for doing this is because he had skipped a train to avoid paying, but got caught by the British Transport Police. The absolute worst thing that could have happened to him as a result of this was a very small fine, but Duffy was terrified that his parents might find out. To avoid punishment, he travelled to London, my assumption being that he had planned to start a new life in the big city. For 4 days he had been sleeping under a bench near the Euston railway station, before he had unfortunately met Nilsen, who offered him a meal and a bed for the evening. Duffy gratefully accepted, unknowingly handing himself over as Nilsen's third confirmed victim. After Duffy had fallen asleep, Nilsen sat on his chest and wrapped a ligature around the young teen's throat. He tightened it as hard as he possibly could, applying, quote, great force, in Nilsen's own words. Gripping as tightly as possible, he maintained this great force until Duffy had fully lost consciousness. Nilsen then dragged his victim into the kitchen by his throat and drowned him in the sink, before proceeding to bathe the corpse. Nilsen later recollected that the corpse was the youngest looking he had ever seen. Duffy's body was first posed on a kitchen chair, and then returned to the bed where he had initially been strangled. Nilsen, truly sickeningly, began to make out with the dead boy's corpse, whilst complimenting and caressing it as he joined it in bed. Nilsen got so turned on by this that he masturbated over the body multiple times. For the next 2 days, Nilsen stored the body in a cupboard, but then decomposition began to set in and the body started to bloat, a process that happens to dead bodies as gas trapped inside of the organs begins to expand and tries to escape. Once Nilsen had noticed this, he decided the time had come for Duffy to join Ockenden, who still remained under the floorboards almost a full 6 months later. Nilsen had grown confident by this point, and thus began to kill with increasing frequency. By the end of the year, he killed a further 5 victims and attempted to kill 1 more. That is almost 1 body for each remaining month of the year. Sadly, only one of these victims would ever be identified, William Sutherland. Later, during police interviews after he had been apprehended, Nilsen shared some details about the unidentified victims. One, who was killed sometime in November, quote, moved his legs in a cycling motion as he was strangled. On another occasion, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to revive the victim. When he realized he had failed, he fell to his knees in front of the mirror. And when he noticed his reflection, he spat at it aggressively. Another time, he had laid in bed with the victim before crying his eyes out to the famous song, Fanfare for the Common Man. He stored all of these victims under his floorboards too. He hadn't removed any of the other corpses by this point, meaning Nilsen was effectively sleeping in a graveyard. Every night, when Nilsen got into bed, he was laying just meters away from 7 dead bodies. As you might expect, eventually the decomposing bodies began to attract insects, who were drawn in by the stench of death. Nilsen still liked to occasionally lift some of the bodies out from underneath, but he had noticed they had become infested with maggots. Some of the victims even had maggots crawling out of their eye sockets and mouths. He placed deodorants and air fresheners under the floorboards and sprayed insecticides in his flat twice a day, but it just wasn't good enough. The flies remained, and the bodies had to go. Near the end of the year, Nilsen removed and dissected the bodies of each victim. He cut them into small, manageable pieces and smashed any large bones that he thought might be recognizable as human. He then built a large bonfire in the garden and placed paper bags containing the body parts on top of it. Finally, he crowned his twisted design with an old car tire. He thought the presence of the burning rubber would disguise the smell of burning human flesh. Somehow, this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that 3 children had gathered to watch the fire, completely oblivious as to what they were actually witnessing. When the bonfire had burned out and was reduced to ash, Nilsen used a rake to search through the debris to see if there are any recognizable bones. After sifting for a few minutes, Nilsen discovered a fully intact skull. He smashed it with a rake, and then gathered the rest of the bone fragments and flushed them down his toilet. On the 4th of January 1981, Nilsen encountered an unidentified man at the Golden Lion pub in Soho. He referred to him as a young Scot. This man was lured to Melrose Avenue after Nilsen had challenged him to a drinking contest. He sounds Scottish to me. As the contest was taking place, Nilsen strangled the distracted Scot and placed him underneath the now vacant floorboards. On the 12th, Nilsen phoned into work and told his employer that he was sick and would need a few days off. He wasn't actually sick, well, he wasn't poorly anyway. His true intentions were to dissect and dispose of the victim, along with another unidentified man who he had murdered recently. Unfortunately, I'm unable to find any information about this victim. Nilsen had an extremely active start to 1981, and had murdered another 2 unidentified victims by April. One was described as an English skinhead that he had met in Leicester Square. The other was described by him only as Belfast Boy, a young Irishman, supposedly in his early 20s. This murder took place sometime during February. Killing had become part of Nilsen's routine by now, and he coldly described it like this: end of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. Floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street. During May, Nilsen cut open these bodies and removed their internal organs. He threw some of these outside by his fence in the hope that animals would eat them, and placed the rest in rubbish bags that he put in the bin. The final victim to be murdered at that Melrose Avenue address was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow. Nilsen encountered Barlow on the 17th of September 1981, slumped up against the wall of his home when he was returning home from work. He asked Barlow if he was okay, only to discover that the young man was weakened from some epilepsy medication that he had been taking. Nilsen suggested that Barlow should be in a hospital and helped him to his feet, guiding him to his flat. Once inside, Nilsen no doubt planned to murder Barlow, but for some reason, he had a change of heart. Instead, he phoned 999 and asked for an ambulance to come and pick up the stranger. The following day, after Barlow had been released from hospital, he returned to Nilsen's home with the intention of thanking him for his good deed. He was invited inside, and after eating a meal, shared some drinks with Nilsen. After a night of drinks, he passed out on Nilsen's sofa. This murder differed from the ones that came before it, because Nilsen didn't use any kind of tool to help him with the strangling. Instead, he used his bare hands. After Barlow was knocked into unconsciousness, drowned and undressed, bathed and masturbated over, he was stored under the kitchen sink. In October, Nilsen's landlord contacted him and told him that he was planning to renovate the property and would need Nilsen to vacate the premises. At first, Nilsen was hesitant, but after being offered £1,000, he felt he could not refuse. On the 5th of October, he was set to move into an attic flat at 23D Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London. But before he could move, he had to dispose of the 2 bodies in his possession. On the 4th, the day before he was planning to move out, Nilsen built another bonfire in the garden and followed the same procedure as before. He once again masked the smell using an old car tire. At his new flat, Nilsen had no access to a garden. He also had no way of hiding corpses in his floorboards since he was on the top floor. Because of this, you may think that would prevent him from committing any more murders. And initially, for the first 2 months at least, you'd be correct in your assumption. However, after 2 months had passed, Nilsen grew restless. He needed to kill again. On the 23rd of November, he attempted to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs, but he stopped himself from going through with it all the way. It is unclear how he met Nobbs, or what happened to the teenager after the act. By March 1982, Nilsen had become desperate. He needed to kill again, no matter the situation. One night, he was drinking alone at a pub in Leicester Square. Here, he encountered 23-year-old John Howlett, and when the pub was closing down for the night, Nilsen invited him back to his flat in order to continue drinking. Once both men had arrived at Nilsen's new property, they continued to drink and watched a movie together. After the movie had ended, Howlett walked into Nilsen's front room where the bed was located and passed out. 1 hour passed and Nilsen unsuccessfully tried to wake Howlett from his slumber. He stood up, poured himself a glass of rum and sat down to drink it, preparing himself for what he knew he was about to do. As Nilsen began to strangle Howlett, he awoke and a massive fight ensued. Howlett defended himself valiantly, managing to turn the tables and even managed to start strangling Nilsen too. Unfortunately for him, fast movement only served to drain his own oxygen, and since Nilsen had started strangling him first, he also was sadly the first to pass out. As Howlett fell into unconsciousness, Nilsen returned to his sofa and sat down for a moment, shaking from the stress of the near-death experience. He wondered if anybody living in the flat beneath him had heard anything. Over the next 10 minutes, Nilsen noticed that Howlett was still breathing and attempted to finish the job by choking him some more with an upholstery strap. This was unsuccessful, so Nilsen dragged his victim into the bathroom and drowned him in the bathtub. For over a week following the murder, Howlett's finger marks were visible on Nilsen's throat. Some time passed, and in May 1982, Nilsen came across Carl Stotter, a 21-year-old gay man, at the Black Cat pub in Camden. Nilsen struck up a conversation with Stotter, discovering that he was deeply upset at the ending of a failed relationship. After buying the 21-year-old a few drinks, Nilsen invited him back to his flat, promising that he had no plans for making sexual advances on him. At the flat, Stotter drank some more before falling asleep in a sleeping bag that Nilsen had provided him. Some time later, he awoke to find Nilsen strangling him. Their eyes made contact, and Nilsen commanded Stotter to stay still, and then everything returned to black. Some more time passed, and Stotter once again awoke, but this time to the sound of running water, before realizing that he was submerged and Nilsen was trying to drown him. Stotter forced his head above the water and blurted out the words, "No more, please, no more." Nilsen ignored this and once again submerged the young man's head under the water. Believing that he had killed Stotter, Nilsen seated him in his armchair. It was at this point that he noticed his dog, Bleep, starting to lick Stotter's face. He realised that Stotter was somehow still alive. Nilsen rubbed his limbs and chest to increase the blood circulation and covered his body in blankets and then laid him on top of his bed. Eventually Stotter regained consciousness and Nilsen hugged him. Nilsen explained that he had almost strangled himself on the zip of the sleeping bag and that he had tried to resuscitate him after. Over the next 2 days, Stotter faded in and out of consciousness. Once he had gained enough strength to question Nilsen about the incident, he asked why he remembered being strangled and then drowned. Nilsen explained that he had become caught in the zip of the sleeping bag while suffering from a nightmare and that he had placed him in cold water because he was in shock. The following day, Nilsen led Stotter to a nearby railway station where he bid the young man farewell. In June 1982, Nilsen was promoted to executive officer at his workplace and was transferred to a different job centre in Kentish Town. 3 months after his promotion, on the 6th of October, he came across a 27-year-old named Graham Allen attempting to hail a taxi in Shaftesbury Avenue. Nilsen asked if Allen would like to accompany him to Cranley Gardens for a meal. As Allen sat, eating an omelette, Nilsen approached him from behind. He strangled Allen, as with the other victims, and then drowned him in the bathtub. He left Allen in the bath for 3 days before dissecting the body on his kitchen floor. Nilsen managed to hold back his urge to kill for another 3 months. On the 26th of January 1983, Nilsen came across a 20-year-old heroin addict named Stephen Sinclair. Sinclair was spotted by an acquaintance in the company of Nilsen, heading to an underground railway station. At Nilsen's flat, Sinclair passed out from the effects of heroin and alcohol in an armchair, whilst Nilsen observed and listened to The Who. Nilsen approached Sinclair, and kneeling before him, he whispered to himself, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." He then viciously strangled the troubled youth to death with a custom-made ligature constructed using a necktie and a rope. At this point, Nilsen noticed bandages on each of his victims' wrists. Removing them revealed that Sinclair had recently attempted to kill himself by deeply slashing each one. After Nilsen had completed his usual ritual of undressing and bathing the body, he applied talcum powder to it as well. He placed 3 mirrors around the bed before stripping down himself, laying down alongside the victim. After several hours of furious masturbation, Nilsen kissed the corpse on the forehead before saying, "Good night, Stephen." He then fell asleep with the body. Eventually, Nilsen also dissected this body and put various dismembered body parts into different plastic bags. He stored these bags all over his flat, one into a wardrobe, another into a tea chest, and a few more into a drawer under the sink in his bathroom. He sealed these bags using the bandages that were covering Sinclair's slit wrists. Nilsen attempted to dispose of the flesh and smaller bones of all 3 victims in the property by flushing them down the toilet. He also boiled the heads, hands, and feet of the victims in order to remove any flesh and make them harder to identify. Less than 2 weeks had passed since the death of Sinclair, when the trains in the property had become blocked. This rather annoyed Nilsen, because the smell had become unbearable, and the sentiment was shared by everybody living below him too. He wrote a letter of complaint to his estate agent, mentioning that the trains were blocked and that the situation for the other tenants and himself had become unbearable. Soon, a diner-road employee, a company that works in drainage and plumbing, named Michael Catran, was sent to investigate what could be causing the blockage. The employee opened up a drain cover at the side of the house, and was surprised to notice it was packed with a flesh-like substance and numerous small bones of unknown origin. Catran promptly reported the suspicious discovery to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. Wheeler advised Catran to postpone any further investigation and to look into it the following morning, since he had turned up at the property during the evening time. As Catran was about to leave, Nilsen struck up a conversation with him in order to discuss the source of the substance. Once Nilsen heard Catran mention how the substance looked like human flesh, he responded with, "It looks like someone has been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the toilet." The next morning at 7:30 a.m, both Catran and his supervisor, Wheeler, arrived at the property. By this point, the drain had been completely cleared. This further aroused the suspicions of both men, and they decided to check the pipes that connected the drain to the house. Within the pipe that connected to the top floor of the house, they were disgusted to find even more human remains. Both Catran and Wheeler agreed that the bones looked like they belonged to a human hand. They both withdrew from the property and contacted the police. When the police turned up, they began to investigate further. The police then found more small bones and scraps of what they also agreed looked like human flesh. These remains were taken to the mortuary at Hornsey, where the pathologist David Bowen let the police know that the remains were indeed human. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and his colleagues returned to the property, where they spoke to some tenants, hoping to ascertain who lived in the top floor flat. After learning that Dennis Nilsen lived up there, the officers opted to wait outside for Nilsen to return from work. When Nilsen did return, DCIJ introduced himself to the despicable serial necrophiliac. He explained that they were here to investigate the blockage in the drains from his flat. Nilsen feigned confusion and inquired as to why the police officers were investigating this matter. He also asked if the two other officers with Jay were health inspectors. Jay informed Nilsen that the other two were also police officers and requested access to the flat to discuss the matter in more detail. Nilsen led the three officers into his flat, and the stench of decay and death became immediately apparent to all three officers. Nilsen was beginning to become quite panicked and asked them once again why they were interested in his drains. Jay informed him that the blockage was made by decaying human remains. Nilsen pretended to be shocked, but Jay wasn't going to have any of that and responded, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" At this point, Nilsen realized that he had been caught and there was no use lying anymore. He pointed to a wardrobe and coldly admitted that the rest of the body could be found inside in 2 plastic bags. As the officers approached, they were overwhelmed by the smell of decomposition. They didn't open the wardrobe, but asked Nilsen if there were any other body parts in the flat or anywhere else that he may have hidden them. Nilsen told them it's a long story. It goes back a long time. "I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest, but not here, at the police station."
The mass had mysteriously disappeared from the manhole.
So on Tuesday night there was a lot of flesh, a lot of meat in the manhole. And when you went back on Wednesday morning, it had all gone?
Yeah, completely. If a manhole can be sparkling, it was sparkling.
And this was it for the kindly killer. Following this confession, he was arrested under suspicion of murder and transported to the Hornsey police station, where they could hopefully get something more formal out of him. During the drive there, one of the officers asked Nilsen whether the remains in his flat belonged to just one person or two. Nilsen stared out the window of the car for the entire journey and eventually responded, 15 or 16 since 1978. This would be the last time the deranged lunatic would ever be able to see the world from outside of a cell. Whilst Nilsen was safely locked up in police custody, a fellow officer, Detective Superintendent Chambers, joined DCIJ and a third detective, and they returned to his flat in order to collect the plastic bags that allegedly contained the body parts of the victims. Once they arrived, the trio made their way upstairs to the top floor flat. Upon gaining entry, the officers made their way to the wardrobe. If they thought the smell of decay was overwhelming before they opened the door, then they were in for a shock once it had been opened. The men gathered the bags and headed out to the Hornsey mortuary. Once they had been handed in, the officers were informed that one bag was found to contain 2 dissected human torsos, one of which had been sliced vertically, and a shopping bag containing a mixture of internal organs. The second bag contained 2 human heads, one entirely devoid of any flesh at all, and a third torso with arms attached, but missing its hands. One final detail the mortician added on was that both heads had been found to have been boiled. On the 10th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen confessed to his crimes in a police interview. Based on information he gave in this interview, further searches of Cranley Gardens were carried out, where police discovered the lower section of a torso and 2 legs stowed in one bag in the bathroom, with another bag containing a skull, a torso, and various bones found in the tea chest. Nilsen also travelled to his old home at Melrose Avenue with the police, where the killings had begun, and pointed to the locations in the garden where he had built the bonfires to burn the victims. Back at the mortuary, Bowen was able to confirm that the fingerprints on one of the bodies matched those on the police file for Stephen Sinclair. At 5:40 p.m. on the 11th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen was formally charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. Formal questioning of Nilsen began that same evening, with Nilsen agreeing to be represented by a solicitor. This seems entirely pointless to me, seeing as he had already confessed to 16 killings, with multiple corpses being found in his possession. Over the following few days, police interviewed Nilsen on 16 separate occasions, totaling over 30 hours. Once the victim had been killed, Nilsen had some ritualistic behaviours that he usually engaged in. First, he bathed the corpse and shaved any hair from the torso. Once the body was clean and dry, he applied makeup to hide any scars or injuries. The corpse was then dressed in socks and underwear before being draped over Nilsen himself. He would then talk to the corpse for hours. Nilsen explained to the police that his victims were, quote, too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex. He kept the bodies of any victims killed at his previous address for as long as decomposition would allow, and upon noticing any obvious signs, he would store them under the floorboards. Before they started to decompose, however, he would stand or lay beside the bodies whilst masturbating for hours. When it came to dissecting the bodies, Nilsen would always start off by masturbating next to the corpse, no matter how badly decomposed it was. Remember earlier when I said the victims had maggots coming out of their mouths and eyeballs? Yeah. This was supposed to be his final goodbye to the victim, before the dismemberment began. This would usually make Nilsen puke, and he would have to get drunk first to gather the nerves to follow through with this disgusting act. Nilsen finally explained that he took no pleasure in the act of killing, but he did, quote, worship the art and the act of death. After the interview process was complete, the kindly killer was transported to HMP Brixton to be held on remand until his trial began. On the 24th of October, Nilsen was finally brought to trial at the Old Bailey and was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. After a 10-day trial, Nilsen was found guilty of all 6 counts of murder and of 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to a lifetime in prison. Following his conviction, Nilsen was transferred to HMP Wormwood Scrubs to serve his sentence. This is where he remained until 2003, when he was transferred to HMP Full Sutton, where he remained incarcerated as an ACAT prisoner until his death on the 12th of May 2018. Okay guys, this video took an incredibly long time to research and write, so if you learned anything or found it informative at all, then please drop a like. It really does show support. It helps the videos get spread around to more people, and in turn helps the channel grow. If you want to see my next video, make sure you subscribe, because I'll be posting a new documentary soon, so if you subscribe you'll be able to see it as soon as it goes live. I post true crime content as often as I possibly can, and if you enjoyed this video then I'm sure you'll enjoy my other content too. Leave a comment down in the comment section below as well. I reply to all of them. I read every comment, so it'd be awesome to see or to hear any of your thoughts about this disgusting case. Other than that, yeah, thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.